There is a house in the suburbs. The year is 1962, and the house is a good one by every measure the decade offers. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, a kitchen with new appliances, a yard where the children play in the afternoons. The neighbourhood looks like 100 other neighbourhoods that were not here 15 years ago and are now everywhere, stretching out from the edges of American cities in long grids of nearly identical lawns and nearly identical roof lines and nearly identical lives. It is early October. The light through the kitchen window is the particular light of autumn mornings, low and golden and a little cold, the kind of light that makes ordinary objects look momentarily significant. The coffee percolator has just finished. The children are eating breakfast at the table. The husband is straightening his tie in the hallway mirror. And the woman at the kitchen sink is looking out the window at the yard, at the oak tree whose leaves are beginning to turn, and she's not quite thinking anything. She's simply standing there, in the morning, in the kitchen, in her life. She has been awake since 6. She will be awake until 11. In between, she will cook 3 meals, clean a house, manage 2 children, iron 4 shirts, make and answer telephone calls, run errands she has been planning since yesterday, and perform, continuously and without acknowledgement, the emotional labour that keeps this household from coming apart. She will do all of this, and at the end of the day she'll be very tired, and the tiredness will not be the tiredness of someone who has run out of things to do. It will be a different tiredness, a tiredness with no name yet. By the following year it will have a name, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now it is October 1962, and the light is golden, and the oak tree is turning, and the woman at the kitchen window is listening to the coffee percolator and feeling something she cannot explain. Close your eyes, settle in. Let the evening carry you gently into this world. This is the story of what was really happening inside those clean, well-managed houses, behind those bright refrigerators and polished floors, inside the lives of the women who kept the post-war world running while the post-war world looked right past them. The story begins where it always begins. In the kitchen, in the morning, in the quiet that comes just before everything starts. If you enjoy listening to sleep history stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. To understand what was happening to the woman at the kitchen window, we have to go back a little further than 1962. We have to go back to the years immediately after the Second World War, when the United States experienced one of the most dramatic social reorganizations in its history, and when the role of women in American life was reshaped in ways that would not be fully understood for another 20 years. The post-war years brought prosperity. After the Depression and the war, after 15 years of collective hardship and rationing and sacrifice, the American economy opened up like a held breath finally released. Men who had expected lives shaped by scarcity found themselves instead in the middle of an unprecedented expansion. Factories that had made military equipment converted to consumer goods. Veterans returned to education subsidized by the GI Bill, to houses subsidized by federally backed mortgages, to a job market that was, for white men with even moderate qualifications, remarkably welcoming. The suburbs grew out of this prosperity with extraordinary speed. Levittown, the first and most famous of the mass-produced suburban communities, broke ground on Long Island in 1947, and within years had produced over 17,000 houses, each one essentially identical, each one occupied by a family that had been, just a few years earlier, renting in a city apartment or living crowded in with relatives. The house was the symbol of arrival. It was the proof that the post-war promise had been kept, that the sacrifice had been worth something, that the future was going to be different from the past. The house came with an implicit design. It was designed for a particular kind of life, and the life it was designed for had a particular role for women. The kitchen was the largest and most carefully appointed room in the house. The living room was comfortable and oriented toward the television set. There was no study for the wife, no studio, no workroom with a door that could be closed. The house said, in its architecture as clearly as in any spoken instruction, the woman who lives here completely. This is her world, this is her domain. The women who moved into these houses had, many of them, their particular recent history. During the war years, significant numbers of women had worked outside the home, drawn in by the labour shortage that came when millions of men left for military service. They had worked in factories and offices and hospitals, doing work that had previously been understood as men's work, discovering in the process that they could do it. This experience had not been universally liberating, and the women who had it had held it with varying degrees of ambivalence. But it had been real, it had happened, and it had left something in those women's sense of themselves that did not simply disappear when the men came home. What the culture required in 1946 and 1947 and the years that followed was that this experience be incorporated into the domestic narrative rather than used to challenge it. The returning veterans needed their jobs back, and the cultural machinery obligingly constructed a story in which women who left the workforce to become full-time housewives were making the right choice, the fulfilling choice, the choice that their deepest natures had been waiting for all along. The magazines wrote this story. The women's pages of newspapers wrote this story. The new medium of television performed this story nightly in the form of programs whose domestic heroines were cheerful and capable and entirely content in their kitchens. And many women believed it, or tried to believe it, or wanted to believe it, because the alternative was to live in constant friction with a culture that had no room for their dissatisfaction. Belief was easier. Belief was the thing that let you get through the morning. The magazines were the primary delivery mechanism for the ideology that Friedan would later call the feminine mystique. Publications like Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's and Good Housekeeping reached millions of households every month, and what they delivered month after month was a remarkably consistent vision of what the American woman was and what she wanted and what fulfilled her. She was a homemaker. She was devoted to her husband and children. She found deep satisfaction in the management of her household, in cooking and cleaning and the arts of domesticity. She was not professionally ambitious, not because she was incapable, but because her real ambitions were domestic, and these were more than sufficient. The vision was seductive in part because it was so complete. The magazines did not merely tell women that they should be content at home. They provided an entire aesthetic and practical program for how to be content, how to find beauty in the domestic, how to understand housework as an art and motherhood, as a vocation and wifehood, as a form of personal fulfillment. They provided recipes that were presented as opportunities for creative expression. They provided decorating advice that treated the home as a canvas. They provided child-rearing guidance that cast the mother as the primary architect of the child's psychological development, which was flattering and also terrifying. The terrifying element was important. The post-war decades produced a new discourse around child psychology that placed an almost unbearable weight of responsibility on the mother. Mothers who worked outside the home deprived their children of the maternal presence those children required. Mothers who were not emotionally available, who were distracted or preoccupied or not wholly given over to the work of mothering, risked producing neurotic or damaged children. To want something other than full-time motherhood was not only personally unfeminine but ethically suspect. It was selfishness dressed up as ambition. The suburban isolation reinforced all of this. The design of the suburbs, whatever its intentions, produced a social environment in which women were geographically separated from each other, in ways that the denser urban environments they had come from had not. In the city, you walked to the market and encountered your neighbours in the street, and had the continuous small social contact of proximity. In the suburb you drove, and the driving meant that social contact required planning, required an invitation and a scheduled time and a destination. The coffee group among neighbourhood women filled some of this gap, but the coffee group operated under social norms that did not permit the naming of dissatisfaction. And so the women in the suburbs of 1958, of 1960, of 1962 were in many cases more isolated than they knew, each one in her individual kitchen with her individual unnamed feeling, each one believing that the feeling was individual, personal, her own particular failure to achieve the contentment that apparently all the other women in all the other identical houses had managed. The ideology worked partly through this isolation. If you could not compare notes, you could not discover that the feeling was collective, and if you could not discover that the feeling was collective, you could not begin to ask what had produced it. The appliances were part of the story too, and they require a slightly more complicated accounting than they usually receive. The labour-saving devices of the post-war kitchen, the automatic washing machine, the electric refrigerator, the vacuum cleaner, the electric range, had genuinely reduced the physical labour of housekeeping compared to what the generation before had done. The woman of 1960 did not spend all day at the washboard or haul ice, or stoke the kitchen range. The time that had been freed by these devices was real. What had not changed was the total demand. Because the time that was freed by the appliances was not given back to the women who had used them. It was filled by the expansion of standards. Cleanliness standards rose as cleaning became easier, and the house that would have been considered adequately clean in 1930 was considered inadequately clean by 1960. Cooking standards rose as refrigeration, and the availability of new ingredients raised expectations of what a proper home-cooked meal looked like. Child-rearing standards rose as the psychological literature put more demands on the mother's active involvement in the child's development. The labour had changed in character, but the total demand had not diminished. And it looked different in ways that made it harder to see as work at all, which was its own particular problem. The woman who spent her day scrubbing laundry on a washboard had done something whose labour content was unmistakable. The woman who ran a load of washing in an automatic machine and then spent 3 hours planning menus and driving children to activities and managing the household's complex logistics had done something whose labour content was much less legible, to others and sometimes to herself. She had managed, she had organised, she had kept things running, and the running of things left no visible marks. In those first post-war years, something very particular happened to the idea of the American woman, and it happened with unusual speed and unusual thoroughness. To understand the full weight of what the 1960s housewife was carrying, we need to trace it from its origins, begin with her mother's generation, or her older sister's generation, the women who had been adults during the Second World War. These women had discovered their own competence in arenas beyond the domestic, and they carried that knowledge in their bodies afterward. It did not disappear when the war ended, even if the culture tried to make it disappear. Their daughters grew up in households shaped by this particular history, even when it was not spoken aloud. They absorbed, often without knowing it, a kind of doubleness, the official story of what women were for and the unofficial, partly suppressed knowledge of what women could also be. This doubleness was one of the things that made the feminine mystique so psychologically potent and so psychologically unstable. It was built on a partially conscious suppression, and what is suppressed does not stay suppressed indefinitely. The social rituals of the suburb reinforced the architecture of the house. Coffee groups among neighbourhood women were generally governed by unspoken norms that kept the conversation in safe channels. The children, the house, the husband's work in the most general terms. Do not, under any circumstances, say the thing that is actually pressing against you. A woman who said, at a coffee group in 1958, that she felt her life was too small, that she was not fully alive inside it, that she missed something she could not name, would not have been met with recognition. She would have been met with concern. She would have been told to see her doctor. She would have been effectively silenced, not through hostility, but through the social grammar's inability to process what she was saying. The isolation compounded the silencing. When you cannot say the thing to anyone, when the social forms around you provide no space for the thing, you begin to doubt the thing. You begin to wonder if it is a symptom of something wrong with you, rather than a reasonable response to something wrong with your circumstances. The silencing becomes internal. You become the agent of your own suppression. And that internal silencing is its own particular kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who is perpetually performing a self that does not quite match the self she actually is. This performance was not insincere precisely. Many women had genuinely internalized the values of the domestic sphere, genuinely loved their children and their husbands, genuinely found pleasure in certain domestic tasks. The performance and the genuine experience were intertwined in ways that made them nearly impossible to separate. When she smiled at the breakfast table, she was both performing contentment and genuinely feeling it, at least in part. The problem was not that her life was wholly bad. The problem was that it was not wholly good, and the culture insisted it should be, and so the not wholly good had no place to go except inward. The inwardness created the exhaustion, not the housework, not primarily. The housework was tiring, certainly, but the specific, historically particular exhaustion of the 1960s housewife was the exhaustion of a person who had been asked to perform a self continuously in front of an audience that included herself for years. It was the exhaustion of suppressed complexity, of a life that was too small for the person living it, and of the effort required to believe, day after day, that the smallness was the right size after all. The golden cage is a useful metaphor precisely because it captures both the comfort and the confinement. The cage was not uncomfortable as cages go. It was warm and well furnished, The bars were polished, the food was good. The people inside it were in many ways cared for, but they were inside it. And the difference between a well-furnished room and a well-furnished cage is not the furnishings. It is the question of whether you can leave. And in 1962, for most of the women we're talking about, the answer to that question was no, not really. Not without tremendous cost. Not without the culture deciding you had failed at the most fundamental thing it asked of you. She stayed. Most of them stayed. And the staying was a choice made under conditions that were not, in any meaningful sense, free. She stayed, and she managed, and she was, by every external measure, fine. And at the kitchen window in the October morning, she felt the thing she could not name, and the oak tree was turning, and the coffee was ready, and the day was beginning again. In 1957, Betty Friedan sent a questionnaire to her Smith College classmates on the occasion of their 15th reunion. The questionnaire asked about their lives since graduation, what they were doing, how they felt, whether they were satisfied. The answers surprised her. The women she had graduated with, women who had received the same education she had, who had been told the same things about what was possible for them, were not by any reliable measure content. They reported a persistent sense of dissatisfaction that they could not explain and could not resolve. They reported feeling trapped, though trapped was their word and it cost them something to use it. They reported a feeling that they had expected their lives to be one thing and found them to be another. Friedan spent the next 5 years trying to understand what she had found. She interviewed hundreds of women. She read the sociological and psychological literature on women's roles in post-war America. She read the women's magazines, the advertising, the cultural materials that shaped women's sense of their own lives. And she developed an analysis that she would publish in 1963 as The Feminine Mystique, a book that would go on to sell over 3 million copies in its first 3 years and change the conversation about women's lives in ways that are still unfolding. The core of Friedan's argument was this: American culture had constructed, in the post-war decades, an image of femininity so compelling and so thoroughly distributed that it had become virtually inescapable. This image told women that their fulfillment lay in their roles as wives and mothers and homemakers, and only there. It told women that professional ambition was masculine and therefore unfeminine. It told women that the life of the mind, pursued for its own sake, was an indication of psychological maladjustment. And it told them all of this so thoroughly, through so many channels and in so many registers, that women who felt the pull of something else, who felt dissatisfied with the domestic sphere, had no framework for understanding their dissatisfaction as anything other than personal failure. They could not name it. They simply felt it, in the morning, at the kitchen window, in the particular hour after the children were in bed when the busyness of the day had finally subsided and the thing had room to expand. Friedan called it the problem that has no name. And naming it, giving it even this provisional and paradoxical name, was in itself a significant act. Because a problem that has no name has no way to be addressed. It cannot be organized against. It cannot be brought to a doctor and treated. It cannot be discussed among friends because there are no words for it. It exists only as a private, sourceless discomfort, a feeling that something is wrong without any accompanying understanding of what is wrong or why. The book was published in February 1963. It was reviewed widely and unevenly. Some reviewers found it brilliant and overdue, others found it exaggerated or politically motivated. The debate it sparked was, and has remained, genuinely complicated. But the response from the women Friedan had described was not complicated. It was immediate and overwhelming and personal, in a way that analytical debate rarely is. They recognized themselves. That was the word they used again and again in the letters that poured into Friedan's publisher in the weeks after the book was published. I recognize myself. I recognize my life. I recognized the thing I had been feeling for years without being able to say what it was. Women who'd been in therapy for years without improvement, who had been taking medication without resolution, who had been quietly suffering inside the unnamed feeling for so long that they had forgotten there was a question to ask about it. These women read the book and discovered that they were not alone. They discovered that the feeling was not unique to them, not a symptom of their individual psychological failure. They discovered that it was shared, widespread, structural. They discovered, in other words, that it was a problem, and not their problem, but a problem of the world they lived in. This discovery was, for many women, the most significant experience of their adult lives, not because the book solved anything, not immediately, but because it named something that had been nameless, and naming, as we said at the beginning, changes everything. To understand what Friedan's intervention meant, we need to understand what had come before it in terms of the professional and cultural response to women's dissatisfaction, because Friedan was not the first person to notice the problem. Therapists and physicians had been noticing it for years, and the response they had generated was, from our vantage point, almost painfully inadequate. The post-war mental health establishment in America was deeply influenced by a particular reading of Freudian psychology, a reading that located women's psychological problems almost invariably in their failure to properly accept their femininity. The influential neo-Freudian writers of the 1940s and 1950s had developed an elaborate theoretical apparatus for explaining why a woman who was unhappy with her domestic role was demonstrating neurosis rather than sanity. This framework was not fringe, it was mainstream, it was taught in medical schools and psychology programs, it was deployed in the consulting rooms of therapists who saw women presenting with the unnamed feeling and sent them away with interpretations that confirmed the culture's diagnosis. The problem was inside them, and the solution was adjustment. Adjustment to what exactly? Adjustment to the domestic role. The therapeutic goal, for a dissatisfied housewife, was to help her become more comfortable with what she was already doing, more reconciled to the limits of her world, more genuinely fulfilled by the tasks of homemaking and motherhood. The therapy aimed to make her smaller, in effect, to reduce her to a size that fit the container she was in, rather than to suggest that the container might be inadequate to her actual dimensions. Some women emerged from this kind of therapy genuinely helped, in the narrow sense. The anxiety was reduced. The unnamed feeling became more manageable. They functioned more smoothly. But a significant number, Friedan found in her research, emerged from years of therapy no more reconciled to their lives, and considerably more convinced that they were broken. They had tried to adjust. They had tried to achieve the proper acceptance of their femininity. They had done the therapeutic work and still felt the thing they were supposed to have stopped feeling. And the implication of the therapeutic framework was that this was their failure. They had not adjusted well enough. What Friedan did, what made the feminine mystique so immediately electrifying to the women who read it, was to suggest that the doctors and the therapists and the cultural machinery were not just inadequate but actively wrong. That the problem was not neurotic, not a failure of adjustment, not a symptom of psychological malfunction. That the problem was structural, social, ideological. That a healthy, intelligent, capable woman might reasonably find the life of a full-time suburban housewife insufficient. That the insufficiency was not a defect in her but a defect in the arrangement. The name did not eliminate the problem. It would take decades of sustained political, legal and cultural work to begin to dismantle the structures that Friedan had described, and some of those structures, as we shall see, are still standing. But the name gave women a language for their experience that was not the language of pathology. It gave them a framework for understanding their dissatisfaction that located its source outside rather than inside themselves. And that shift, from personal failing to structural problem, from neurosis to reasonable response, was the beginning of the possibility of change. The doctors who were not therapists but general practitioners or internists were, in many ways, less equipped to deal with the situation. They saw women who complained of fatigue, vague malaise, anxiety without clear cause, depression that was not quite clinical in its severity. They ran the tests they knew how to run, found nothing, and reached for the prescription pad. Meprobamat in the early 1950s, then the barbiturates, then the benzodiazepines, culminating in Valium in 1963. These drugs managed symptoms. They reduced the acute discomfort of the unnamed feeling. They did not because they could not address its source. There is something important to hold on to here as the story unfolds. The women who felt the unnamed feeling were not suffering from weakness. They were suffering from perception. They perceived, accurately, that their situation was inadequate to who they were, and perception, when it cannot be expressed or acted upon, becomes exhaustion. It becomes the particular bone-deep tiredness of someone who is living at a distance from herself, who is pouring her energy into the maintenance of a version of her life that does not quite include her. That was the exhaustion. That was what it was, underneath the housework and the children and the appliances and the very modern kitchen. that was what the woman at the kitchen window was feeling on that October morning in 1962, watching the leaves of the oak tree begin to turn. The ideology of the feminine mystique did not sustain itself. It was maintained actively and expensively, and with considerable sophistication, by a complex of commercial and media interests that had a significant financial stake in keeping women in the roles they occupied. To understand the exhaustion of the 1960s housewife is to understand not only the psychological weight of her situation, but the elaborate infrastructure that had been built to prevent her from questioning it. Advertising was the most direct and most powerful element of this infrastructure. The American advertising industry of the post-war decades was, in retrospect, conducting a vast and largely unremarked experiment in mass psychology. It was not simply selling products. It was selling an identity, a vision of what it meant to be a woman, and it was doing so with a subtlety and persistence that made the selling nearly invisible. You did not feel, reading an advertisement for dishwashing liquid in 1959, that you were being told what your life should look like. You felt instead that the advertisement was reflecting back at you something you already knew, something obviously true about women and kitchens and the satisfactions of a clean house. This reflection was the technique. The advertisements did not argue. They did not persuade in the overt rhetorical sense. They simply showed. They showed women in kitchens smiling. They showed women in clean houses satisfied. They showed women whose children were healthy, and whose husbands were appreciative, and whose floors were bright. And they offered a simple implicit claim that the products being advertised were the instruments by which this version of life was achieved. Buy this wax and your floors will shine. Buy this detergent and your white shirts will be whiter. Buy this cake mix and your family will love you more completely. The advertising worked partly by collapsing the distinction between the product and the self. The woman who used the right soap powder was not merely cleaning her clothes more effectively. She was demonstrating the quality of her womanhood. The woman whose refrigerator was less than fully stocked was not merely running low on groceries. She was failing in her primary responsibility to her family. The domestic product was never just a product. It was a test, and the woman who passed the test was rewarded with the currency the advertisements trafficked in: the approval of her husband, the health of her children, the admiration of her neighbours. Television amplified all of this. The television programs of the late 1950s and early 1960s that depicted domestic life presented a vision of the American home and the American woman that was as complete and as seamlessly polished as the advertisements that surrounded them. The television housewife was always neatly dressed, even when cleaning. She was always good-humoured, even when exasperated. She was always primarily oriented toward her family's needs, always finding satisfaction in meeting those needs, always fundamentally content in a way that her occasional comedic difficulties never seriously disturbed. These programs were not realistic portraits. Even the most casual comparison with the women watching them from their own living rooms would have revealed an enormous disproportion between the television version and the reality. But the power of the television image was not in its realism. It was in its repetition, and in the particular way that repeated images shape expectations over time. Women who watched these programs night after night absorbed an image of what a housewife should be that was considerably more polished and considerably more consistently pleasant than what they actually experienced. And the gap between the image and the experience was experienced not as a problem with the image, but as a problem with the woman. The women's magazines extended and deepened the television's work. These publications reached women in the mornings, in the afternoons, in the quiet hours between the children's bedtime and their own, and they reached them in a register that was more intimate and more personal than the broadcast medium. The magazine spoke to the individual woman in a way that television, by its nature, could not. It gave recipes with a friendly voice that seemed to understand your specific kitchen situation. It gave child-rearing advice with a confidence that seemed authoritative. It was always personal, it was always helpful, and it was always, in its deep structure, telling the same story, that the domestic life was the good life. The psychological mechanisms the magazines deployed were sophisticated enough to have attracted the attention of motivational researchers, a new breed of consumer psychologist who studied how people made purchasing decisions and what emotional needs consumer products were designed to fulfill. Friedan, in her research for the feminine mystique, spoke to several of these researchers, who were remarkably candid about their methods. They had discovered that the housewife was susceptible to a particular kind of appeal, to her sense of herself as a professional in her own sphere. If you position the domestic role as a skilled occupation, requiring expertise and judgment, women responded. The technique acknowledged the intelligence and capability of women, while channeling that intelligence and capability entirely toward the domestic sphere. It was, in its way, a very elegant trap. The elegance of the trap lay in its ability to co-opt the energy that might otherwise have been used to challenge it. A woman who experienced her domestic role as a profession, who took pride in her expertise as a cook, and her judgment as a household manager, and her skill as a mother, was less likely to ask whether the profession itself was an adequate use of her full capabilities. The pride was real. The expertise was real. The trap was not that these things were false. The trap was that they were partial. The result for the women who lived inside this machinery of contentment was a kind of double life that was not experienced as duplicity, but as dissonance. On the surface, her life was what it should be. The house was clean, the children were cared for, the husband was fed. She had done all of the things she was supposed to do, and done them well, and could not say why the doing of them had not produced the promised satisfaction. She could not say it because the machinery had removed from her the vocabulary for saying it. She had the language of contentment, which the culture had given her abundantly. She did not have the language of dissatisfaction, because the culture had never made room for that language. This linguistic dispossession was one of the subtler forms of violence the ideology enacted. A person who cannot name an experience cannot communicate it, and a person who cannot communicate an experience cannot discover that it is shared. The isolation and the silencing and the linguistic dispossession worked together to maintain the condition they described. A woman alone in her kitchen, with a feeling she could not name, believing herself to be alone in that feeling, and therefore believing herself to be defective. She was not defective. She was perceiving something real, the perception and the inability to act on it, and the continuous effort of managing the gap between what she felt and what she was supposed to feel. This was the exhaustion, not the housework. The housework was hard, but the housework at least produced visible results. The fatigue of the housework had a source you could point to. These dishes, that floor, those shirts. The fatigue of the feminine mystique had a source that could not be pointed to because the culture had made sure it had no name. Let us follow her through a day. Not a dramatic day, not a day when anything happens that could be called an event. An ordinary Tuesday in October 1962, in a suburb outside any American city, in a house that is clean and well managed, and in every visible way a success. The alarm goes off at 6:30. She's already partially awake, the way mothers of young children are always partially awake, one part of the mind always engaged even in sleep monitoring. She gets up before the alarm can wake her husband. She pulls on her robe, the blue cotton one, and goes to the bathroom and then downstairs to the kitchen. 6:35. The coffee percolator is filled and started. This is a task she could do in her sleep and often does, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind is not yet fully arrived for the day. The kitchen is quiet. This is the best part of the morning, this brief window before anyone else is awake, when the house is hers in a way it will not be for the rest of the day. She stands by the counter and listens to the percolator and looks out the window at the yard. The oak tree is turning. The light is low and golden. She's thinking about nothing in particular. 6:50. The children need to be up. She goes upstairs and opens her daughter's door. 8 years old, deeply asleep, her hair spread across the pillow. She puts her hand on the child's shoulder and says, "Good morning," quietly. The child stirs. She goes to her son's room. 6 years old, already showing signs of waking, his eyes moving under closed lids. She opens the curtains. He protests. She tells him it is time. 7:05. Breakfast is scrambled eggs and toast, orange juice from the frozen concentrate, coffee for herself. The children are dressed, more or less. Her daughter's socks do not match, and her son has his shirt on inside out. She corrects the shirt. The socks are a battle she's not going to fight this morning. She pours coffee and sits with them while they eat, and she's present, attentive, managing the conversation and the small logistics of the meal, while simultaneously maintaining in her head the running list of what needs to happen before noon. The list: grocery shopping, because she's low on milk and needs something for dinner, and the dry cleaning needs to be picked up because her husband has a meeting tomorrow and his grey suit is there. and the form for her daughter's school trip needs to be signed and returned today, and she needs to call the plumber about the bathroom faucet that has been dripping for 2 weeks, and she needs to write a thank you note to her sister-in-law for the birthday gift that arrived last week. The list is not written down anywhere. It exists only in her head, a constant background process running alongside everything else she does. It has always existed, this list. It will always exist. It refreshes itself automatically. As one item is completed, another takes its place. 7:40. The children are sent to school. She stands at the front door and watches them walk down the street, her daughter talking, her son running ahead until they turn the corner. The street is quiet again. She goes back inside. 7:45. Her husband comes down for breakfast. She makes his eggs. She pours his coffee. She sits with him while he eats, and they talk about the day ahead, his meeting, the plumber, the form for the school trip. And the conversation is easy, comfortable. The conversation of two people who have been together long enough that their communication has become largely automatic. She does not say the thing. The thing is not available to her this morning. It rarely is in the morning when the busyness of the day's beginning is too strong to allow space for it. It comes later, in the quiet hours. 8:20. He leaves. She clears the breakfast things and washes up. This takes about 20 minutes. Then she makes the beds, both children's rooms and her own, tidying and smoothing with the efficient movements of long practice. Then she starts the laundry, sorting the week's accumulation by colour and temperature, loading the machine, measuring the detergent. The machine is a good one, automatic, a luxury she appreciates genuinely. While the machine runs, she vacuums the living room, moving the furniture aside, doing the edges with the attachment, putting the furniture back. This takes 30 minutes. 9:30. She gets in the car and goes to the grocery store. The grocery store is a particular kind of social event, one of the few places she's likely to see other women during the day, without the deliberate arrangement of a visit or a coffee group. She encounters her neighbour in the vegetable aisle, and they talk for several minutes, about the children, about the upcoming school event, about a new recipe one of them has seen in a magazine. The conversation is pleasant. She does not say the thing here either. The thing is not what you say in the vegetable aisle of the grocery store. 10:15. Home with the groceries. She puts them away, a task she's always found more satisfying than it perhaps warrants. The refrigerator organised, the cans in the pantry lined up, the produce washed and put in its drawer. The laundry needs to go in the dryer. She transfers it and starts the second load. She sits down with her coffee, which is cold now, and the magazine she's been working her way through for the past 4 days. The magazine. She reads it the way she reads everything these days, in pieces, interrupted, a page here and a page there between the tasks that require her attention. She has been reading the same article about a woman writer for 3 days and is only halfway through it. The woman writer has an interesting life. She lives in New York and has published 2 novels and seems to know many interesting people. She reads about this life with an attention that is not quite envy, and not quite longing, and is perhaps most accurately described as recognition, the recognition of a self that might have been, the shadow self that she carries alongside her like a companion who never quite arrives. 11:05, she calls the plumber. She's put on hold for 4 minutes. She signs the school trip form while she waits. The plumber can come Thursday between 2 and 4. She writes it in the calendar. Noon. She eats her sandwich standing at the kitchen counter. This is something she does more often than she sits at the table to eat, this standing eating, and she is not sure when it started, but she suspects it is connected to the fact that eating while standing does not count in quite the same way as eating while sitting. It is not a meal, it is a refueling, something done in transit. Her life has a great deal of this transience in it, a great deal of being in the middle of something, on the way between one task and another. She's rarely simply anywhere. She's almost always in the middle. 1:15. The laundry needs to come out of the dryer and be folded. This she does on the kitchen table, making careful neat stacks. Her husband's shirts, the children's small things, her own items, the household linens. Folding laundry is one of the tasks she has always found genuinely satisfying. The clean clothes warm from the dryer, the stacks growing tidy. There is something in the orderliness of folded laundry that speaks to something in her, some deep preference for pattern and completion. 2 o'clock. The afternoon stretches ahead of her with a quality that is different from the morning's quality. The morning is structured, task-driven, the day's momentum carrying her forward. The afternoon is looser, the tasks less urgent, and in the looseness there is a particular kind of difficulty. She's not tired enough to rest, not occupied enough to stop thinking, not busy enough to prevent the thing from rising up. She reads. She makes a telephone call to her sister. She begins the preparations for dinner, chopping the vegetables earlier than she needs to, more as a way of having something definite to do than out of cooking necessity. 3:30. The children come home from school. Her daughter brings a drawing she made in art class, a house with a family in front of it, the sun very large and very yellow, the people small and stick-figured and smiling. Her son lost his mittens. The afternoon becomes immediately more textured, more various, more demanding and more alive. The snack to be given, the homework to be supervised, the disagreement about the television to be mediated, the question about whether a friend can come over tomorrow to be considered and answered, the mitten situation to be addressed with resignation. 5 o'clock. Her husband comes home. The evening begins. Dinner is ready at 6, served and eaten and cleared away by 7. The children's baths are at 7:30. Bedtime stories at 8. She reads to them with genuine pleasure, her son on one side and her daughter on the other, the three of them in the lamplight of the children's room, the story carrying them all away from the day for a little while. 9 o'clock. The children are asleep. She and her husband watch television together, sitting side by side on the sofa, and it is comfortable, and it is the closest thing to genuine rest the day has offered, and she is grateful for it. The television provides something to look at. The thing is present, the way it is always present in the quiet hours, but she manages it the way she manages it every evening. She lets it be there without looking at it directly. 11 o'clock. She turns off the lamp in the bedroom and lies in the dark listening to her husband breathe. She thinks about tomorrow, which will be like today, and the day after, which will be like tomorrow. She is not unhappy. She's also not quite happy. She's something else, something that does not yet have a name, something between those two familiar things, in the space where the unnamed feeling lives. She closes her eyes. The house settles around her. The neighbourhood is quiet, and the woman in the bed, in the house, in the suburb, in the October night, is falling asleep, and the thought she's carrying as she falls is the same thought she cannot finish. The sentence that does not yet have an end. I am, I am, I am. Let us linger in this house a little longer. Consider the kitchen again. The kitchen of the early 1960s American suburban home was, by almost any measure, a technical marvel compared to the kitchens of previous generations. The refrigerator was large and reliable. The electric or gas stove was responsive and controllable. The washing machine handled in an hour what would have taken a woman an entire day to do by hand. These were genuine improvements. The women who used them knew it. And yet the kitchen was also a container. It was the room she was always in, or coming back to, or thinking about being in. It organised her day. The kitchen said, begin here, at the coffee percolator, in the half-dark of the morning before anyone else was awake. The kitchen said, end here, at the sink, with the last dishes of the day being washed while the family watched television in the next room. The kitchen was her office, and her studio, and her laboratory, and her social room, all in one, and it was a very small room, and it was the same room every day. The physicality of this confinement is something that can be hard to convey at a distance, but it matters. Human beings are, among other things, spatial creatures. The spaces we inhabit shape our experience in ways that are not only symbolic but physiological. A person who spends most of their waking hours in the same small space, performing the same sequences of movements, encounters the walls of that space at a level below conscious thought. The body knows it is circling. The body registers the limits, and over time, the body's knowledge of those limits becomes a kind of low-grade anxiety, a physical restlessness that is not the same as unhappiness, but is related to it, a sense that the space available for movement is insufficient for the animal that inhabits it. The walk to the grocery store was important for this reason. Not because it was intellectually stimulating, not because it provided the kind of engagement that a fully deployed mind requires, but because it was a movement through space. It was a traversal of distance. It was the body moving through a world larger than the kitchen, and the body experienced this as something, registered it as something that mattered, even if the mind, occupied with its grocery list and its domestic calculations, did not particularly notice. The children's bedtime was important too. After the children went to bed, after her husband had settled in his chair or retired to the bedroom, there was a brief window of time, perhaps an hour, perhaps a little more, that belonged to her in a different way than the rest of the day had. The tasks were not pressing in quite the same way. The demands were suspended, and she could sit with her book or her sewing or her television program, and the sitting was different from the rest of the day's sitting, which had always been interrupted, always transitional, always on the way to something else. This hour was, or could be, an end in itself. What she did with this hour varied enormously from woman to woman. Some read, some watched television with a genuine absorption that the day's other activities rarely permitted. Some wrote letters to old friends, long letters that unfolded at a pace the rest of her correspondence did not allow. Some sat and did nothing in particular, which was its own form of recovery. And some felt the unnamed feeling most acutely in this hour, because the quiet and the stillness removed the forward momentum of busyness that had kept the feeling at a manageable distance during the day. In the stillness of the late evening, the feeling had room to expand, and in that expansion it sometimes became something very close to grief. Her name was Helen, and in 1961 she was 34 years old and had been a housewife for 11 years and had been seeing the same psychiatrist for 3 of those years, and she was tired in a way that the psychiatrist had not been able to fix. The tiredness was not depression, or not exactly. She was not unable to function. She woke up and got through the day and made dinner and talked to her husband and put the children to bed and did all of the things. She just did them from a great distance, as though the real Helen had moved back several feet from the surface of her life, and was watching the performing Helen go through the motions with a kind of sad and helpless attention. Her psychiatrist told her she had adjustment difficulties. He had told her this for 3 years. He had given her exercises for the adjustment difficulties, and she had done them. The adjustment had not occurred. In 1961, her doctor prescribed her diazepam, which would be marketed as Valium, and would within a decade become the most widely prescribed drug in the United States. It worked, in the sense that the distance between Helen and her life diminished. The performance felt less like a performance and more like the thing itself. She functioned. She was pleasant at dinner. She managed the household without the low-grade constant anxiety that had been her companion for years. But the clarity was also gone. She described it later, much later, as a frosted window. The light was still coming through, and the shapes, but the sharpness was gone. And the sharpness, she understood in retrospect, had been her perception of her own situation. The Valium had not made her better. It had made her less aware of how not better she was. The benzodiazepines, of which Valium was the most famous but not the only member, were introduced to American medicine in the late 1950s and early 1960s, following the barbiturates and the meprobamies that had preceded them. Each generation of these compounds represented a genuine pharmaceutical advance, more effective, with fewer serious side effects, less dangerous in overdose than what had come before. But the fundamental use case was constant across all of them: the management of anxiety in people, predominantly women, who presented to their doctors with complaints that did not map neatly onto any physical diagnosis. The doctors who prescribed these drugs were, in most cases, genuinely trying to help. They saw patients who were distressed. They had a tool that reduced distress. They used the tool. The system was working as it was designed to work. They were operating within a framework that had been given to them by their training and their culture, a framework that did not include the concept of structural conditions producing symptoms in otherwise healthy people. They were not equipped to diagnose what Helen had. They were equipped to diagnose and treat Helen. The pharmaceutical companies understood the cultural context and worked with it with considerable skill. The advertising they directed at physicians in the early 1960s was sophisticated in its appeal to the doctor's self-conception as a healer of the whole person. It suggested that the prescribing doctor was not merely treating a symptom, but restoring a woman to her proper functioning, enabling her to be the wife and mother she was meant to be. This framing appealed to the doctor's sense of doing good. A woman who could manage her household and care for her children without excessive anxiety was a woman who had been successfully treated. This measure was circular in a way that the physicians of the period generally did not notice. They were measuring health by the patient's ability to perform a role that was itself, for some significant proportion of patients, the source of the symptoms they were treating. Treating the anxiety of the woman who found her domestic life insufficient in order to return her to the domestic life that was producing the anxiety was not healing. It was maintenance. It was keeping the machine running. But the medical framework of the period could not see this, because it had accepted, as thoroughly as the rest of the culture, the premise that the domestic role was the appropriate and natural destination for women. By 1969, Valium had become the most prescribed drug in the United States, and the majority of its prescriptions were written for women. The demographics of its use were not coincidental. The drug was managing a specific population's specific experience of a specific set of circumstances. The population was women. The circumstances were the domestic life in its post-war form, and the management, while it reduced acute suffering, did not address the conditions it was managing. It was treatment without cure, because the cure would have required changing not a chemistry but a culture, and changing a culture is the work of decades. The women who took the pills were, many of them, aware at some level that something was not quite right about this arrangement. The pills kept things running. They kept the acute edge of the unnamed feeling filed down to something manageable. They allowed women to perform the role without the performance becoming visibly unbearable. This was both a kindness and a cruelty. A kindness because the pain was real and the relief was real, and a cruelty because the relief made it possible to continue indefinitely in conditions that should have been changed. Helen stopped taking the medication in 1966. She stopped not because she decided to exactly, but because her youngest child started school that year, and she found herself, suddenly, with several hours a day that were unscheduled, unstructured, not organised around anyone else's needs, and in those hours, without the medication, the thing came back, the feeling, the unnamed feeling, and it was large and it was real, and she sat in her clean, empty, perfectly organised kitchen and felt it fully for the first time in 3 years. She did not go back to the doctor for more medication. She went instead to a meeting in the basement of a church in her neighbourhood, a meeting of women who were talking about their lives. She had heard about the consciousness-raising groups that were forming in the late 1960s, though she did not know them by that name yet. She sat in a folding chair in the church basement and listened to women say things she had never heard said out loud before, and she recognised every word, and the recognition was so physical and so overwhelming that she cried. The woman next to her put a hand on her arm and said, "I know, we all know." She had not known they knew. She had thought she was alone. The Valium years had been years of believing she was alone, that the frosted window was a personal defect and not a structural condition. Now she understood differently, and understanding differently changed what was possible. Not immediately, not without difficulty, not without the long and complicated process of renegotiating a life that had been organised entirely around other people's needs. But it changed what was possible, and that was the beginning. Her name was Dorothy, and she had graduated from Radcliffe in 1951 with a degree in history, and she was, by 1959, living in a 3-bedroom house in New Haven, with a husband who taught at Yale, and 2 children who were 5 and 7, and she had not read a full historical monograph from beginning to end in 4 years. The history degree from Radcliffe had been more than a qualification. It had been an identity, a way of being in the world, a particular relationship to the past and to the written forms in which the past was preserved and interpreted. She had been, during her university years, a person who inhabited that relationship fully. She had read widely and argued carefully and produced work that her professors had found impressive. She had been, in a word, that the 1950s would not have applied to a woman without ambivalence, a scholar. Now she was a faculty wife. This was a specific social category in the academic world of the 1950s, a category with its own demands and its own unspoken protocol. The faculty wife was educated. All the faculty wives at Yale in 1959 had been to good colleges, most of them to the women's colleges of the Northeast, and her education was valued in its way as a social asset. She could converse with her husband's colleagues. She could hold her own at the departmental parties. She was not an embarrassment. She was an ornament, which is a different thing, and the difference was not always comfortable to inhabit. There is a specific kind of grief that belongs to educated women of the post-war generation. and it is worth trying to render it precisely because it shaped so much of what came after. It was not the grief of women who had been told they could not attend university. By the 1950s, significant numbers of American women were receiving university educations, and the society around them had developed an elaborate and somewhat contradictory attitude toward this fact. On the one hand, educated women made better wives and mothers, or so the argument went. On the other hand, they were expected to contain their education within the domestic sphere. The education was welcome as an ornament. It was unwelcome as an engine of anything else. The women who graduated from the women's colleges in the late 1940s and through the 1950s had, in many cases, been educated by faculty who did not hold this view. The faculty of Smith and Wellesley and Radcliffe and Barnard were, many of them, women who had built careers in the face of considerable resistance, women who had found ways to pursue their intellectual work alongside or instead of the domestic life the culture offered. They modelled something. They embodied the possibility of a life organised around the mind's work. And their students absorbed this possibility through 4 years of close proximity to it. Then they graduated and they married and they moved to the suburbs, and they discovered that the world outside the women's college did not particularly share their faculty's view of what women could be. The professional world, the academic world, the creative world, all operated on assumptions that had not substantially changed from those of the pre-war decades. Women were welcome in certain limited roles, as teachers, as nurses, as secretaries, as the supporting cast in enterprises run and directed by men. The notion of a woman as the primary intellectual authority in her field, as the lead researcher rather than the research assistant, was genuinely unusual and frequently unwelcome. So the educated woman of the 1950s faced a particular version of the problem. She had been given tools, real tools, intellectual tools for engaging with the world. She had been shown, by example, that women could use those tools in the public sphere, and she had then been placed in a situation in which using those tools in the way she had been educated to use them was made extremely difficult, both by the practical structures of the labour market and by the ideological structures of the feminine mystique. The result was a strange kind of intellectual homelessness. The educated housewife of the 1950s was not at home in the domestic sphere in quite the way that less formally educated women might be, because her education had given her a different orientation toward the world, a different expectation of engagement, and she was not at home in the public intellectual sphere because the culture had placed enormous obstacles in the way of her participating in it. She belonged fully to neither world, and the partial belonging to both left her in a no-man's land of identity that was its own form of exhaustion. Dorothy navigated this no-man's land with the particular skills available to her. She read. She thought. She maintained, in the margins of her domestic life, the intellectual practices that her education had established. But the maintenance required constant effort against the grain of her circumstances, and the circumstances won more often than not. The reading was interrupted. The thinking was fragmented. The intellectual practices were squeezed into the spaces the domestic life left open, and the domestic life, by design, left open very few. The journal she subscribed to piled up on the bedside table. She fell behind. She felt guilty about falling behind. She read the first pages of articles and could not finish them because the children needed something. She carried the unfinished articles around in her head as a kind of reproach, evidence of the gap between what she was intellectually and what the day's demands permitted her to be. This gap was not static. It widened over time, as the years of fragmentary intellectual engagement accumulated. A historian who does not read history for 10 years is not the same historian she was. The field moves, the debates shift, the frameworks evolve. The knowledge acquired in college and graduate school does not disappear exactly, but it becomes disconnected from the living practice of the discipline. The person who had once been an emerging scholar becomes, gradually and painfully, a former scholar. The identity shifts from something active to something remembered, and the remembering is accompanied by a grief that has no adequate object, because the loss did not happen through any single event, but through the accumulation of 1,000 small interruptions. The women who had not gone to college did not experience this particular version of the problem. Their version was different, equally real, equally pressing. But the college-educated housewife of the 1950s carried an additional weight that was the weight of the explicitly unrealized. She knew what she was not doing. She had a name for what was going unused. She could see, with uncomfortable clarity, the disproportion between her education and her employment, and she had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, that this disproportion was appropriate, even desirable, that the highest use of a Radcliffe degree was in the raising of Radcliffe-caliber children. And she could not quite believe this, even when she tried. She had the thought sometimes that she was disappearing. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, in the way that things disappear when they are not used. The part of her that had been a historian was dimming, not gone, but dimmer than it had been, further from the surface, harder to access, and she could not entirely tell whether this was inevitable, the natural consequence of a life organised around other priorities, or a choice she was making by not fighting harder against it, and not being able to tell was its own form of exhaustion. In 1963, Dorothy read The Feminine Mystique. She read it in 4 sittings, which for her at this period of her life was a remarkable commitment of time and attention. She read it with her pen in her hand, making marks in the margins the way she had been trained to mark books in school, and the margins of her copy were dense with her reactions. Yes, and this, and I know this, and where has this been? She finished the book and sat for a long time in the kitchen. The children were at school, her husband was at the university. The kitchen was quiet. She picked up the telephone and called the friend who had recommended the book to her. Dorothy said, "I read it." And then she could not immediately say more, because the thing that was pressing up through her was too large for the telephone, too large perhaps for language, the recognition of herself that the book had produced, the recognition that she was not alone, that the gap she'd been living in was not her personal failure, but a cultural arrangement that had been made without her consent and maintained without her knowledge. Her friend said, "I know, I cried too." And the 2 women talked for an hour, which was a very long telephone call in 1963, and the talking was the beginning of the conversation that would, in various forms, continue for the rest of both their lives. We have been talking mostly about the psychological dimension of the 1960s housewife's exhaustion, and that dimension is central and real. But the physical dimension is also real, and it is worth examining in some detail, because the body was also keeping a record of the life being lived in it, and the body's record does not lie. Sleep was one of the first casualties. The mother of young children is, almost by definition, sleep-deprived, and the sleep deprivation of early motherhood is well understood and widely documented. What is less understood is the way in which the sleep patterns of the 1960s housewife were also shaped by the anxiety that was the unnamed feeling's most embodied form. She woke in the night not only when the children needed her, but also, increasingly, without any external cause, the anxiety itself becoming a disruption of her sleep architecture. She lay in the dark next to her sleeping husband, and her mind ran the list. What needed to happen tomorrow? What might go wrong? What she had not done today that she should have? The chronic mild sleep deprivation that resulted from this pattern had effects that were not dramatic but were cumulative and significant. She was more emotionally reactive than she otherwise would have been, quicker to irritation, slower to recover from frustration, less able to find the patient register that the children and the household management required. She was less cognitively flexible, and she was less able to access the emotional resources that would have made her situation more bearable, the capacity for pleasure, for genuine connection, for the simple enjoyment of her children that she had expected to be the reward of the domestic life, and found, too often, to be just out of reach. Nutrition was another dimension. The 1960s housewife ate last. This was not a rule anyone had made explicit. It was simply what happened when you spent your day in relation to other people's needs. She cooked for the family and served the family and ate what was left, which was sometimes very little, sometimes served cold, sometimes eaten standing at the kitchen counter between tasks. The nutritional adequacy of her own diet was the last item on the list, the one that got addressed only after everything else had been addressed, which meant it often did not get addressed properly at all. Iron deficiency anemia was common among women of reproductive age who were not attending carefully to their iron intake, and the fatigue it produced was physical as well as emotional. The leaden heaviness of a body that is not adequately oxygenated, the effort required to do ordinary physical tasks, the sense of working against an internal resistance that should not be there. She might have attributed this to the unnamed feeling, or to the children, or to the general demands of the domestic life, rather than to the simple fact that she was not eating well enough, because the simple fact was invisible to the culture that surrounded her. Exercise, or the lack of it, was a third dimension. The domestic labour of the 1960s was physically active in some ways. The carrying of groceries and laundry, the bending and lifting and climbing of stairs, the constant low-level movement of a person who spends her day in a house with children. But it was not aerobically demanding in the way that produces the neurochemical benefits that are associated with sustained cardiovascular exercise. The housewife moved, but she did not move in the ways that her body most needed. There is a particular quality of tiredness that comes from emotional labour that is never acknowledged as labour, and this quality is worth examining with some care. Emotional labour is the work of managing one's own emotional states and the emotional states of others in service of a particular social or professional role. The flight attendant who maintains a warm smile through the discomfort of a turbulent flight is performing emotional labour. The nurse who holds a patient's hand and projects calm while managing her own anxiety is performing emotional labour. So is the teacher who contains her frustration with an unruly classroom. The 1960s housewife was performing emotional labour continuously, and performing it in a context where it was entirely invisible and entirely unpaid. The 1960s housewife was managing her own emotional states in service of the domestic role, containing her frustration when the children were difficult, suppressing her anxiety about money, smoothing over her disagreements with her husband in the interest of domestic harmony, maintaining the warmth and composure that the role demanded even when she felt neither warm nor composed. She was also managing the emotional states of others, regulating the children's emotional environment, attending to her husband's moods, being the person in the household who noticed when someone was upset and addressed it. This work is real. It requires real skill. It produces real consequences when it is done well, and real dysfunction when it is done poorly. And it is exhausting in a specific way, because it requires the sustained suppression of one's own emotional reality in service of the emotional reality of others. The woman who is managing everyone else's feelings has no one managing hers. She is the emotional centre of the household, and is paradoxically the most emotionally alone person in it. The loneliness of this role was another thing that the culture did not acknowledge, and the women themselves often could not name. They did not feel lonely in the obvious sense, the sense of being isolated from human contact. They were with people constantly, with children, with neighbours, with their husbands in the evenings. They were rarely physically alone, but they were emotionally alone in a way that physical aloneness does not capture. Alone in the sense of being the person who managed everyone's feelings while no one managed theirs. Her husband, in most cases, did not know her in this way. This is not a criticism of the husbands, most of whom were decent men doing what the culture required of them. But the culture had not required of them that they know their wives in this deeper sense. The deeper knowing, the attention to the wife's actual inner life, her needs as a person rather than as a role, was not part of the job description that the culture had given husbands. The body kept all of this. The body kept the record of the sleepless nights, the cold meals eaten standing, the hormonal disruption of chronic mild anxiety, the specific physical tension of suppressed emotion held in the shoulders and the jaw and the chest. The body kept the record of the years of putting oneself last, of the energy expended on other people's comfort that was not replenished, of the physical consequences of a life that did not have enough room in it for the physical needs of the person living it. She was tired. The tiredness had many sources and not all of them were legible, and the illegible ones were perhaps the most draining of all. What would it have meant for her to be less tired? It would have meant sleep that actually rested her, which would have required lower baseline anxiety, which would have required being able to name and address the unnamed feeling. It would have meant eating adequately, which would have required the time and the habit of attending to her own physical needs, which would have required a culture that valued those needs as worth attending to. It would have meant movement that discharged the stored tension of the emotional labour. It would have meant, in other words, a different arrangement. And a different arrangement was not available, not yet, not in 1962. The year 1963 was the year of several things that the woman at the kitchen window did not know yet. In October 1962 were coming. It was the year Betty Friedan's book was published, in February. It was the year in November of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. which broke something in the American national mood that had already been under pressure for several years. It was the year in which the civil rights movement reached a kind of visible crescendo. The Birmingham campaign in the spring, the March on Washington in August, Martin Luther King's speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It was a year in which the post-war settlement was being tested on multiple fronts simultaneously. The civil rights movement was important to the story of the 1960s housewife in ways that were not always direct or obvious. The movement provided, for many of the women who had become the feminist movement of the late 1960s, a crucial set of conceptual tools and organizational models. The idea that a group of people could suffer under conditions that had been presented to them as natural and inevitable, and could organize to name those conditions as political rather than natural, and could demand change. This idea, demonstrated by the civil rights movement with enormous courage and at enormous cost, was available as a template. But the connection between the civil rights movement and the emerging women's movement was not only intellectual, it was also a matter of what had become thinkable. The civil rights movement had made visible the gap between the American promise of equality and the American reality of structural exclusion. Once that gap was visible in one context, it was harder to prevent it from becoming visible in others. The woman at the kitchen window, watching the news coverage of Birmingham and Washington on the television in her living room, could not always prevent the comparison from forming. Here too there was a gap between promise and reality. Here too there was a structural arrangement presented as natural that was in fact contingent and changeable. The figure of the woman at the kitchen window in 1963 is a figure at a specific historical hinge point. On one side was the world that had been built around her, the post-war settlement with its suburbs and its magazines and its medical establishment and its ideology of feminine fulfillment through domestic life. On the other side was a world that was, in the early 1960s, still mostly hypothetical, still mostly a set of promises and possibilities that had not yet been organized into anything that looked like a movement or a reality. The hinge was the moment, and the moment required someone to name it. Friedan named it, but she did not name it alone, and the naming would not have mattered if there had not been a world ready to receive it. The world was ready because of several overlapping developments that had been building through the late 1950s, and that reached a kind of critical mass in the early 1960s. The emerging counterculture was beginning to challenge the values of the post-war settlement, not yet in the specific terms of women's liberation, but in the broader terms of questioning conformity and the limits imposed by a society organized around consumption and comfort, and the suppression of genuine selfhood. What Friedan offered was not, primarily, a destination. She did not tell these women where they should go or what they should do with the energy and intelligence and ambition that their lives had been asking them to suppress. What she offered was something more fundamental: the permission to be in motion, the acknowledgement that the journey was not over, that the destination had not been reached, that the feeling of not arrival was not neurosis, but accurate perception. She gave them back their own experience, which is the most important thing anyone can give a person who has been told for years that their experience is wrong. The letters that came to Friedan after the book's publication are among the most remarkable documents of the period. They came from women in every state, and they said over and over in different words the same fundamental thing: I thought I was alone. I thought it was just me. I thought there was something wrong with me. And then I read your book, and I understood that there was something wrong with the arrangement I had been put in. The response to this gift was not uniform. Not all women who read the book were immediately liberated by it. Liberation is not an event, it is a process. And the process for many women was long and complicated and often uncomfortable. It required renegotiating relationships, challenging structures, asking for things that the culture had told them were not theirs to ask for. The transition was not comfortable, but it was the right direction. And the women who made it, who allowed themselves to be destabilized and then found their way to something more adequate than the life they had been handed, these women produced daughters who grew up with different assumptions, not perfect assumptions, not uncomplicated ones, but different. And different was, after the long sameness of the post-war decades, everything. There is a particular quality to the hours just after that discovery. The hours when the woman who has just read the book and recognized herself in it is still in the kitchen, still surrounded by the familiar objects of her familiar life, but something has shifted. The kitchen is the same, the coffee cup is the same, the window is the same, and the oak tree is the same, and the October light is the same, and she is different. Not entirely, not yet. But a door has been opened, and the air coming through it is the air of a different world, and she can feel it on her face. She picks up a pen. This is something she will describe later as the moment she did not know was significant until she had lived further into it. She picked up a pen and wrote something. Not very much. A few lines in a notebook she had not opened in months. She did not know what she was writing toward. She did not know, sitting there in the kitchen on an afternoon in early 1963, that she was participating in a historical moment. She was just picking up a pen. She was just beginning to write the sentence she'd been unable to finish for years. I am. The woman who put down the Valium and went to the church basement meeting. The woman who picked up the pen. The woman who recognized herself in Friedan's pages. These women did not step directly into a better world. They stepped out of one set of constraints and into the beginning of a long process of negotiating a different arrangement, and the long process was difficult and imperfect, and is not finished. The second wave of feminism that followed the publication of The Feminine Mystique was a genuine political movement that changed the law and the culture and the economy in ways that are real and significant. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited employment discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race, opened professional doors that had been structurally closed. The founding of NOW, the National Organization for Women, in 1966, with Friedan as one of its founders, created an institutional vehicle for the political demands that the women's movement was beginning to organize. The consciousness-raising groups of the late 1960s and early 1970s created spaces where women could say the things they had been unable to say, the things about their marriages, their desires, their anger, their grief, their sense of being trapped inside lives that were too small. These changes were real. The world that existed for women by 1980 was significantly different from the world that had existed in 1960, and the difference was not accidental, but was the result of organized political effort, sustained over years, by women who had started from the kitchen window and the church basement, and the recognition in Friedan's pages, and had built something that mattered. And yet, the double burden was one of the first things the women who entered the workforce in the 1970s discovered about the new arrangement. They had jobs, real jobs, jobs with salaries and responsibilities, and the simple daily acknowledgement that their work was work. And they also had homes that needed to be managed and children who needed to be cared for, and emotional labour that needed to be performed. And the cultural expectation that women would continue to perform the domestic and emotional labour of the household had not changed at the pace at which women's participation in the workforce had changed. She had more to do. She had not been given more help. The sociologist Arlie Hochschild, writing in 1989 in a book called The Second Shift, documented what women had been experiencing for 20 years, that the women who had entered the workforce were working what amounted to an extra month of 24-hour days per year compared to their male partners in the unpaid domestic labour that continued to fall primarily to them. The second shift was not a theory, it was a measurement, and what it measured was the gap between what the feminist movement had changed and what it had not yet changed. In the years since Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, the story has been told many times, and the telling has accumulated a kind of cultural sediment that can make it hard to see the original thing clearly. The received interpretation tends toward triumphalism. The problem was named, the movement arose, things changed, women were liberated. This is not wrong exactly, but it is too clean. The actual story is messier and more instructive, and, in its messiness, more relevant to where we are now. The women who changed as a result of Friedan's book did not simply step out of their suburban homes into a world that was ready for them. They stepped out of their suburban homes into a world that was deeply ambivalent about their arrival, that wanted the labour they could offer, but was uncertain about the authority they were claiming. This is not a counsel of despair. The situation of women today, in the most general terms, is significantly more adequate to women's full humanity than the situation of 1963. The professional world, while imperfect, contains women in roles and at levels that were largely inaccessible 60 years ago. The legal framework, while incomplete, provides protections that did not exist. the cultural representations of women, while still often limited and reductive, are more varied and more honest than the monolithic image of the happy housewife that saturated the 1950s. And yet the women who are listening to this story in the dark before sleep will recognise something. Not the same experience, not the same context, not the same specific historical constraints, but some version of the underlying dynamic, the experience of being expected to manage more than is acknowledged, to care more and be seen less, to fit inside definitions of what they are and what they owe that do not quite match the full reality of who they are and what they are capable of. The woman at the kitchen window in 1963, pen in hand at the October light, is not a figure from a distant and irrelevant past. She's an ancestor, in the most meaningful sense, of the women who came after her. She's the person who felt the unnamed feeling and did not entirely capitulate to the culture's insistence that the feeling was wrong. She began. And beginning is the thing. Beginning is always the thing. The unfinished story is, in the end, the most honest kind of story. It does not resolve into triumph or tragedy. It resolves into continuation. The work going on, the conversation going on, the women going on, finding in each generation new names for the things that have not yet been adequately named, and new ways to act on the understanding that the naming makes possible. The conversation Betty Friedan started in 1963 is still happening. The woman at the kitchen window is still there in some form, in some kitchen, in some suburb or apartment or farmhouse, looking out and feeling something she is still, perhaps, trying to name. The man who came home at 6 o'clock in the evening came home from a world. This is the thing that is easy to overlook when we are focused on the woman who stayed behind. He came home from streets and offices and the social complexity of a workplace, from conversations with people who pushed back against his ideas and problems that resisted his first attempts at solution, from the daily experience of being a person among other persons in a world that was indifferent to his comfort and required him to earn his place in it. He came home from all of this to a house that had been made to receive him. Moving. Because the house was made with genuine love. The woman who had managed that house all day had done so in part out of genuine care for the man who would return to it. She wanted him to come home to warmth and order and the smell of dinner. She wanted the transition from his hard day to the family's evening to be made as smooth as possible. These were not performances, or not only performances. They were expressions of love within the only idiom available to her, within the structures she was inhabiting. Difficult because the making of the house into a place of reception for the husband was only one part of what the woman had been doing all day, and the smallest part. She had been running a complex operation. She had been managing children and logistics and the 1,000 small decisions that kept the household functional. She had been doing this continuously, without a break, without a commute during which to decompress, without the structure of a job that ends when you leave the building. And now, at 6 o'clock, the man came home from his world and stepped into hers, and the question of what happened next was a question that neither of them had been given adequate tools to answer. Robert, our man with his decent heart and his tired shoulders and his newspaper under his arm, had very few resources for understanding what his wife's day had contained. The culture had not provided him those resources. He knew that she had been home, he knew the house was clean and dinner was cooking, he knew she had been with the children, and he knew at some level that this was a form of work, though the culture had given him no framework for how much work, or what kind, or what toll it took. He came home and he accepted the dinner she brought him, and he was grateful for it, genuinely grateful, and he did not know that gratitude was not quite the same as acknowledgement. She did not know how to ask for it. The culture had not given her that framework either. It had given her, instead, a framework in which asking for acknowledgement of her domestic labour was itself a kind of failure, an indication that she was not doing the work in the spirit in which it was supposed to be done. Real domestic love, the framework said, did not require acknowledgement. A woman who needed her husband to recognise what she had done all day was a woman who had misunderstood the nature of the role. The role was not about exchange, it was about giving. This framework produced over time a particular kind of marital loneliness that had nothing to do with the quality of the love between the two people involved. They loved each other. That was not in doubt, but they inhabited their shared life in such different ways, with such different textures of experience, that genuine understanding across the divide was difficult and often did not happen. He lived in the public world and came home to the private one. She lived entirely in the private world and had no access to the public one except through him. She tried, sometimes, to describe her day to him, and he listened when he had energy to listen, with the particular kind of attention that is given to something that is being registered but not quite understood. Her day was full of events and difficulties and small triumphs and frustrations that were entirely real to her and entirely abstract to him, because he had no experiential framework for understanding what it meant to manage 2 children all day in a house, to cook 3 meals and clean up after all 3, to hold simultaneously in one's head the grocery list and the dentist appointment, and the hem that needed sewing, and the letter that needed writing. He listened. He nodded. He said something that was meant to be sympathetic, and then he picked up the newspaper and she went back to the kitchen to wash the dishes, and the distance between them was not large in any single moment, but it was consistent, and consistency has a cumulative effect. And the cumulative effect over years was a form of isolation that lived inside the marriage like a quiet, drafty room, not large enough to be the whole of the house, but impossible to heat. The marriage was not a failure. In most cases, it was a success by the standards the culture used to measure marriages. Durable, orderly, producing well-fed and reasonably well-adjusted children, providing the economic and emotional platform the post-war settlement had designed it to provide. But inside the successful marriage, inside the clean house and the regular dinners and the settled routines, something was not quite resolved. Something was being managed rather than addressed, and the managing cost something every day. She made it look easy. That was her greatest achievement and her greatest cost. She made it look so easy that nobody thought it was hard, and nobody thought it was hard because nobody was asking, and nobody was asking because she had made it look easy. The circle closed. The cost continued. And at 6 o'clock in the evening she heard the door and called out dinners almost ready. And the day folded itself into the evening, and the evening would fold itself into another day, identical and entirely required and entirely her own. There is something in the particular ritual of the 6 o'clock dinner that rewards sustained attention, because it contains, in concentrated form, all of the dynamics we have been tracing throughout this story. The dinner table was the nightly performance of the family as the culture wished the family to be, gathered, fed, together. And she was the one who had produced it, who had planned it and shopped for it and cooked it and served it, and who sat at it with the presentation complete around her, and who was, in the middle of the family gathering, in some fundamental sense alone. She had made this happen, and in the making happen she had become, in some way that she could not entirely articulate, the background of a scene she had authored but could not quite inhabit. There is a passage in many women's memoirs of the period, or the period's aftermath, that describes a particular image: the mother at the kitchen sink from the child's perspective. The child is at the kitchen table, doing homework or eating a snack or simply present in the way that children are present in kitchens, and the mother is at the sink facing the window, and she is still in a way that is different from ordinary stillness. She is not washing dishes. She is not making anything. She's just standing there, and the child watches her without quite knowing what she's watching, and the image stays. These images recur in enough accounts to be more than coincidental. They represent the moment when the child catches a glimpse of the person behind the role, the person who has something going on in her interior life that is not about the cooking, or the cleaning, or the children, the person who is briefly, in the early afternoon quiet, somewhere else. The child does not know where the mother is. The mother does not fully know where the mother is, but the child sees her there, in that private somewhere, and the image writes itself into memory with a permanence that ordinary domestic images rarely achieve. What did those children understand, or not understand, or half understand about what they were seeing? Some of them, the ones who later articulated it, described a feeling of something like unease. Not fear exactly, but a sense of their mother being not entirely present in a way that was disturbing, not because she was gone, but because she was there and not there simultaneously, physically in the kitchen, and mentally somewhere the child had no access to. Others described it as the first intimation they had that their mother was a person, that behind the role of mother there was a self, and that the self had its own weather. This latter recognition was, in retrospect, important. The 1960s housewife had been so completely subsumed in her role, had performed it with such continuity and such competence, that the self behind the role was often genuinely invisible to the people in her household. Her children did not see her as a person so much as a condition. a precondition of their own existence and comfort, as fundamental and as unexamined as the walls of the house. She was the background of their lives, necessary and invisible. The glimpse of her at the kitchen window was the moment when the background shifted slightly, when the permanence of the role flickered, when the self behind it was briefly legible. And what those children saw in the mother at the window was something they carried with them. Some of them carried it as a warning, a determination not to become that particular version of stillness, not to subsume themselves into a role so thoroughly that the self became visible only in unguarded kitchen moments. Some of them carried it as a question. What was she looking at? What did she want? What was she not saying? And some of them carried it as a kind of love, the complicated love of a child for a parent who is doing their best inside constraints. The child only later comes to understand. The daughters were particularly attentive. There is research suggesting that daughters are more likely than sons to identify with and model themselves on their mothers, and the relationship between the 1960s housewife and her daughter was one of the more fraught relationships the decade produced. The daughter was watching her mother with a particular intensity, trying to understand what women were for, what she herself was going to be. And the mother was performing continuously the role that the culture had assigned her. The daughter absorbed both things, the performance and, in the kitchen window moments, the person behind the performance. Some daughters absorbed the performance and replicated it. They grew up and made the same choices, or choices that looked the same from the outside, though the interior relationship to those choices was sometimes different, more conscious, more deliberate, informed by the complicated inheritance of watching their mothers at the sink. Some daughters rejected the performance wholesale, fled the domestic sphere with a vehemence that sometimes hurt the mothers who had performed it faithfully, who had not understood that their faithfulness was being read as warning. And some daughters spent a long time in the middle territory, trying to work out which parts of the mother's life they wanted and which parts they needed to refuse, trying to separate the genuine love and genuine pleasure that had existed alongside the suppression from the suppression itself, trying to honour what was worth honouring without inheriting what should not be inherited. This work, the work of sorting through the inheritance, is never entirely finished. It is done in relationships and in therapy, and in the choices one makes about how to organise one's daily life, about whose needs come first in the morning, and whose feelings are managed and whose ambitions are accommodated, and whose presence in the household is structured around being a resource to others. These are not abstract questions. They are the questions of ordinary life, and the answers to them are still being negotiated by women whose grandmothers stood at kitchen sinks in 1962 and looked out at yards they could not quite see. The mother at the kitchen window is, in this sense, not a historical figure. She is an ongoing figure. She is present in every household where the distribution of care and labour and attention has not yet been made equitable, which is most households, which is the world. The specific form of her situation has changed. She is likely to have a job now, likely to have more options than her grandmother had, likely to be having conversations about the dynamics of her domestic life that her grandmother could not have had. But the underlying question remains, how much of yourself do you give to the role, and how much do you hold back for the self? And how do you negotiate that balance in a culture that has historically valued women's self-giving and discounted their self-holding? And the daughters who are watching their mothers now catching glimpses of the person behind the role in the unguarded moments. These daughters are doing what daughters have always done. They are watching. They are absorbing. They're trying to understand what women are and what women can be and what they themselves are going to be. They are in the most literal sense inheriting, and what they inherit depends in part on what we choose to pass to them. Not only the exhaustion, though the exhaustion is real and it is still there, but also the naming, also the knowledge that the unnamed feeling can be named, and that naming it changes what is possible. Sleep softly now. Let the house settle around you. The October light has faded. The oak tree is still. The children are in their beds and the dishes are done and the day has finished its long asking. In the quiet of the house, in the dark behind your closed eyes, let the woman at the kitchen window be still too. Let her rest. She has been at the window long enough. She has done her work. She has held the household. She has kept the people she loves from falling. And now, in the dark, in the quiet, she can be still. She can let the day go. She can let the day go. We began in a kitchen in October in a house in the suburbs. We began with the coffee percolator and the oak tree turning, and the woman at the window feeling something she could not name. We have travelled a long way since then, through the architecture of the post-war settlement and the machinery of the feminine mystique, through the medical establishment's prescription pad and Betty Friedan's typewriter, through the particular tiredness of the body and the particular grief of the mind and the particular love of the child who watches from the kitchen table. And we return now to the kitchen. It is night. The household is asleep. The dinner dishes are washed and put away. The counters are clean. The children's lunches are prepared for tomorrow morning, lined up in the refrigerator in their little bags. The house is orderly and quiet and held. She's at the window one more time, but the window is dark now, the yard invisible, and what she sees in the glass is her own reflection, a woman, in her own kitchen, at the end of a long day. She looks at herself for a moment. There is something she's trying to see. In 1963, she found a name for it. In the years after, she found other women who had felt it too. In the decades that followed, she found, sometimes, ways to live less at a distance from herself, to occupy her life more fully, to be known as more than a function. The work was hard and it was long and it is not finished. But she is still here. She's still at the window, and outside the glass, past her own reflection, the world is turning toward morning. The oak tree stands in the dark yard. The leaves have almost all come down now. The branches are bare against the sky, and against the bare branches the first pale suggestion of the dawn is beginning. Barely a lightening, barely a change, but it is there. Let your eyes close now. Let the kitchen go quiet. Let the woman turn from the window and walk through the dark house and find her bed and lay herself down. She has earned this rest. They all have. The day is over. The night holds everything gently. And somewhere in a suburb in America, in an October long past, the oak tree stands in the yard and the light is beginning, and the story continues, and you are asleep. Sleep well. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. Did your mother or grandmother ever describe this kind of quiet exhaustion? The feeling of having everything the world said she should want, and still feeling like something essential was missing? Share in the comments. We would love to hear your family's story. Time moves differently inside a house. This is one of the things the 1960s housewife knew in her body that she could not easily have put into words, and that the culture around her had no framework for acknowledging. Time in the public world, in offices and factories and schools and shops, is measured time. It is parcelled into units, and the units are accounted for, and the accounting produces at the end of each week a number that represents the value of the time spent. The exchange is legible. You know what your time was worth because you were paid for it. Time in the domestic sphere does not work this way. It is not measured, not in the same sense. It is not parcelled. It flows in a different pattern, and the pattern is shaped not by the clock on the wall, but by the needs of the people in the house, which are irregular and continuous and do not respect the hour. A child who needs something needs it when the need arises, not when the schedule allows. A sick child who needs tending does not become a well child at the end of the working day. The domestic temporality is responsive rather than scheduled, contingent rather than planned, and it exhausts in a different way than the measured time of the workplace. She had thought, before she had children, that she understood what her day would look like. She had imagined something orderly. The morning tasks completed, the afternoon free for herself, the evening a pleasant shared time with her family. This was not an unreasonable imagination. It was, in fact, the image that the culture had given her, the efficient housewife who had her work done by noon, and her afternoons for herself. The magazines depicted this. The television housewives seemed to accomplish it effortlessly. The reality was different. The reality was that the needs of young children do not organize themselves into a neat morning block. The reality was that a house with 2 children in it is a house in which the unexpected is the primary feature of the day, in which the plan made at 8 in the morning bears only a rough resemblance to the actual events of the day by the time the afternoon has arrived. She learned to hold her plans lightly. She learned to expect interruption. She learned to complete tasks in fragments, to return to the half-chopped vegetables and the half-written letter and the half-finished thought. to pick up from wherever she'd been forced to put something down. This fragmentary relationship to her own activities was one of the subtler forms of the exhaustion. It is a specific kind of tiring to never quite finish anything, to always be in the middle of something else, to carry the accumulation of half-completed tasks and interrupted thoughts and deferred intentions through every day of every week. The fragment is not only the unfinished task, it is the unfinished sentence, the unfinished feeling, the thought that was beginning to take shape, that had the quality of something almost understood, that was interrupted before it could complete itself and was then lost in the press of the next immediate thing. Psychologists who have studied attention and cognitive load describe the mental cost of this kind of fragmentation. It is not simply the inconvenience of being interrupted, it is the metabolic cost of repeated context switching, of pulling the attention away from one thing and redirecting it to another, and doing this many times throughout the day. Each switch costs something. The cost is not dramatic. It does not feel like a major expenditure in any individual instance, but the accumulation over a full day and a full week and a full year is real, and it shows up in the particular quality of tiredness that is different from the tiredness of sustained effort. It is the tiredness of a person whose attention has been pulled in too many directions for too long, who's had too little time to think any thought all the way through. The afternoon had a particular character, and it is worth dwelling on it. Between the completion of the morning's tasks, which might fall anywhere between 11 and 2, depending on what those tasks had involved, and the return of the children from school, which happened at 3:30, there was a period of time that was neither fully occupied nor fully free. It was the time of the unscheduled hours, and it was, for many women, the time when the unnamed feeling pressed most insistently against the surface of the day. Because there was nothing in that interval that absolutely required her attention. The children were at school, her husband was at work, the morning's tasks were complete or nearly so. There was dinner to begin thinking about, but dinner did not need to be begun yet. There was always something she could do, always a task that could be moved up from tomorrow's list, always a surface that could be cleaned again, or a drawer that could be reorganized. But there was also the possibility, thin and fragile, of not doing any of those things, of sitting with her coffee and her magazine, of reading the full article rather than the first 2 pages, of simply being present in the quiet house without doing anything in particular. This possibility was not as available as it sounds, because the culture had given her a framework in which unproductive time was suspect, in which sitting was a form of failing, in which the proper housewife was always in motion, always improving, always adding value to the domestic sphere. The woman who sat down in the afternoon with a novel was a woman who was not making the most of her time. This was not a rule anyone had made explicit. It was an atmosphere. It was something she felt rather than heard, a slight but persistent sense that resting was a form of giving up, that the afternoon's quiet was a test she was supposed to be passing differently than she was. And so the afternoon became another kind of performance, the performance of adequate occupation. She was always doing something, always visible to the imaginary audience that the culture had installed somewhere inside her sense of herself, always able to account for her time in the currency of domestic productivity. She was not resting. She was preparing dinner slightly ahead of schedule. She was not reading. She was catching up on correspondence. She was not sitting with her thoughts. She was planning next week's menu. The performance of adequate occupation was exhausting in a particular way, because it deprived her of the recovery that the unperformed time might have provided. The late afternoon, the hour between 3:30 and 5 when the children were home and her husband had not yet arrived, was another quality of time entirely. This was the most textured hour of her day, the most demanding in certain ways, the most alive. The children brought the world in with them, the drama of the school day, the friendships and enmities and small triumphs and large disappointments that constituted the social world of the primary school. They brought their homework and their hunger and their need for attention. They brought sometimes their fear or their excitement or their grief. She received all of this. She was the receiver, the container, the person into whose care the world of the children was poured each afternoon at 3:30. And the receiving was real work, not the mechanical work of tasks to be completed, but the deeply skilled work of attention and attunement, of reading the child correctly and responding with the right quality of presence, of knowing when to ask and when to simply be there, of managing the energy of the afternoon so that it arrived at the dinner hour in a condition that the family could manage. This was the work that was most invisible. It left no record. It produced no visible result. At the end of the afternoon, the house looked the same as it had at the beginning, and the children would not have been able to articulate what their mother had done for them in those 2 hours before dinner. But if she had not done it, if the afternoon had been managed less skillfully, if the homework supervision had been impatient rather than patient, if the small crisis of the lost mitten had been handled with anger rather than with the resigned pragmatism she brought to it, they would have felt the difference. The quality of the evening would have been different. The family's ability to sit together at dinner in something like comfort and ease would have been compromised. The invisibility of the skilled work is the hardest thing to convey, and it is the thing that most needs to be conveyed, because it is the source of the particular injustice the feminine mystique produced. The housewife's labour was not simply unacknowledged. It was structured to be unacknowledgeable. Its highest quality of execution was its invisibility. The more skillfully she managed the household, the less apparent the management was, and the less apparent the management was, the less visible the skill. She was most appreciated when her work was most invisible, which meant she was most appreciated when she was, paradoxically, working hardest. Let us spend a little more time with the magazines because they repay the attention. To read the women's magazines of the late 1950s and early 1960s today is to have an experience that is both familiar and strange. Familiar because the techniques they used are techniques that consumer media still uses, and strange because the specific content they deployed seems, at this remove, almost shockingly programmatic. The gap between what was offered and what was withheld is now visible in a way it was not when these publications were the water in which their readers swam. What was offered? A complete vision of the well-managed domestic life, recipes that were practical and aspirational in equal measure, suggesting that the competent housewife could serve something both genuinely good and impressively ambitious to her family every night of the week, decorating advice that treated the home as an expression of the woman's aesthetic intelligence, implying that the quality of her colour choices and her furniture arrangement said something meaningful about who she was, child-rearing guidance that was simultaneously reassuring and anxiety-producing, telling mothers both that they were doing the most important job in the world and that the stakes of doing it wrong were catastrophic. What was withheld? Any sustained acknowledgement that the women reading these magazines might have desires that could not be met within the domestic sphere. Any representation of a woman's professional life as interesting and valuable in itself, rather than as a temporary expedient before marriage or a secondary complement to the primary domestic role. Any honest engagement with the question of what happened to a person's sense of herself over years of work that was socially devalued and intellectually undemanding. Any suggestion that the exhaustion and the dissatisfaction and the unnamed feeling that many readers were carrying might be reasonable responses to their situation, rather than symptoms of personal failure. The absence of these things was not accidental. The editors of these publications were not ignorant of the realities of their readers' lives. Many of them were themselves women of considerable professional achievement, who had navigated the contradiction between their own ambitions and the ideology they were required to purvey. The absence was structural, a product of the economic relationship between the magazines and the advertisers who paid for them, and of the cultural logic that made the domestic sphere the only available framework for addressing a female readership in the post-war decades. Advertising revenue depended on the continued purchase of domestic products. The continued purchase of domestic products depended on the woman remaining in the domestic sphere and continuing to identify the domestic sphere as the locus of her fulfillment and self-expression. A magazine that said to its readers, "Perhaps the domestic sphere is insufficient for you. Perhaps you would be happier and healthier with a different arrangement of your life," would have been soaring off the branch it was sitting on. The ideology and the economics were mutually reinforcing, and the woman in the kitchen was the hinge on which both turned. The recipes deserve a particular examination, because they are perhaps the most transparent expression of the transformation of domestic labour into domestic art that the feminine mystique required. The recipes in Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping in 1960 were, taken as a body, a remarkable document. They were more elaborate than the cooking of the previous decade had been. They incorporated ingredients and techniques that were presented as signs of sophistication and international awareness. They required more time and more skill than the plain cooking of the Depression and wartime years had required, and they were presented as the natural and desirable expression of the good housewife's care for her family. The elaboration of the recipes was not random. It was a response to the time freed by the labour-saving appliances, and it was the mechanism by which that time was reclaimed for the domestic sphere. The washing machine gave the housewife back the hours she'd spent doing laundry by hand. The magazine filled those hours with the expectation of a more elaborate dinner. The vacuum cleaner reduced the time required for floor care. The magazine filled the recovered time with the expectation of a more beautifully decorated home. The appliances liberated time, and the magazines recaptured it, and the net change for the housewife was approximately zero. This is not to say that the more elaborate cooking was not enjoyable for some women some of the time. The creative dimension of cooking is real. The pleasure of producing something genuinely good, of feeding the people you love with something you made with skill and attention, is real. The magazines were not wrong to suggest that cooking could be a form of creative expression. They were wrong only in suggesting that it was sufficient, that it was adequate to the full range of what a capable and intelligent woman needed to do and be and make in the world. The creativity of the kitchen was real but partial, and the partiality was the trap. The child-rearing content of the magazines was perhaps the most psychologically complex element of the package, because it engaged directly with the emotional investment that mothers had in the well-being of their children, and leveraged that investment into an enormous expansion of the mother's felt responsibilities. The post-war child psychology that these magazines popularized was a particular interpretation of Freudian and later object relations theory that placed the mother's consistent, warm and fully attentive presence at the center of the child's healthy psychological development. The well-adjusted child was the child whose mother had been there, always, in the right way, at the right moments, providing the right quality of attention. This framework had genuine scientific underpinnings. The importance of early attachment is real, and the research supporting it is substantial. But the way the magazines deployed it went well beyond the research into something closer to a guilt machine. Every moment the mother was not fully present was a potential damage to the child's development. Every expression of her own needs or desires that competed with the child's needs was a failure of maternal adequacy. Every limitation on her patience, every moment of genuine distraction, every ordinary human inability to be fully attentive to another person's needs for every moment of every day was evidence of insufficiency as a mother. This was not sustainable. It was not sustainable physiologically because no person can maintain continuous full attentiveness without rest and recovery. It was not sustainable psychologically because the anxiety produced by the standard of perfect maternal presence was itself incompatible with the calm and warmth the standard required. And it was not sustainable in terms of the mother's own sense of herself as a complete person, because the reduction of her entire identity to the quality of her attentiveness to her children left no room for the other dimensions of who she was. The woman who read these magazines absorbed all of this. She absorbed the recipes and the decorating advice and the child-rearing guidance and the implicit ideology that held them together, the ideology that said, "This is your world, and it is complete, and the measure of your adequacy as a woman is how well you inhabit it." And she carried this absorption with her into the kitchen, and the kitchen became the stage on which the absorbed ideology was performed, and the performance was continuous, and it was never quite good enough because a standard of performance that is defined by invisible adequacy is a standard that can never be definitively met. There is a particular body of work that came out of the 1950s and early 1960s that can be read as a document of the named feeling, or the nearly named feeling, before Friedan gave it its name. It is the work of the confessional poets, a group of writers who included, most notably and most painfully, Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, and who produced, in the spaces between their domestic lives and against the grain of the cultures they inhabited, poetry that was about the interior life of women in ways that poetry had rarely been before. Sylvia Plath is the figure who most completely embodies the intersection of the feminine mystique and its consequences. She was, in her biography, almost a case study in the cultural logic we have been tracing. She was extraordinarily gifted, a scholar, a poet, a writer of formidable intelligence and ambition, a woman who was by any measure more than adequate to the demands of the public intellectual world. She was also a woman who had thoroughly internalized the culture's expectations of femininity, who wanted to be a good wife and a good mother and to keep a beautiful house, and to provide the domestic warmth and order the culture required, and who experienced the conflict between these aspirations and her literary ones not as a political problem but as a personal failure. The Bell Jar, published in January 1963 under a pseudonym, the same month Friedan's book appeared, is the most sustained fictional account of what the unnamed feeling was like from the inside. Its protagonist, Esther Greenwood, is a young woman of brilliant intelligence who finds herself in the summer before her final year of college, having won a prestigious internship at a New York magazine, unable to write and unable to want anything, and unable to find any of the futures being offered to her: the domestic future, the professional future, the creative future, adequate to who she is. She descends into the bell jar of her own depression, and the descent is rendered with a precision and honesty that makes the book 60 years later still difficult to read without recognition. Plath was, at the time she wrote The Bell Jar, a housewife in Devon, England, managing 2 small children and a house while her marriage collapsed around her. She was writing in the months between the summer and the winter of 1962, the poems that would be published after her death as Ariel, poems of extraordinary power, poems that were doing something in language that had not been done before, that were finding words for the experience of being a woman inside the constraints of the world she inhabited, that were precise and furious and alive in a way that her earlier, more controlled work had not been. She died in February 1963. She was 30 years old. The connection between her death and the life she was living has been made many times, and it is important to be careful about it, because the biography of a single person cannot stand in for the analysis of a structural condition, and because Plath's death was the result of many factors that are not reducible to the feminine mystique. But it is also true that she was a woman of exceptional capability who was living inside a set of cultural arrangements that did not have room for her capability, and that the recognition that those arrangements were inadequate came, in the form of Friedan's book, the same month she died. The timing is not causal, but it is significant, and it is the kind of significance that resists being tidied away. Anne Sexton's trajectory was different in its specifics, but similar in its broad shape. She began writing poetry in her late 20s, after a breakdown, at the suggestion of her therapist, and she produced a body of work that was, like Plath's, deeply engaged with the interior life of a woman inhabiting the domestic sphere while being, in some essential way, unable to be entirely contained by it. Her poetry is about motherhood, and marriage, and mental illness, and the body, and the particular experience of being a woman in the 1950s and 1960s who could see her situation with a clarity that the culture insisted was pathological. Both Plath and Sexton were in therapy. Both were, at various points, medicated. The therapeutic and pharmaceutical responses to their distress followed the logic we have traced. The distress was located inside the individual and addressed individually, through the adjustment of the individual's relationship to her circumstances, rather than through any questioning of the circumstances themselves. That both women were producing, out of precisely the distress that was being managed and medicated and therapeutically adjusted, work of lasting significance that documented the reality of their experience with extraordinary precision. This did not register within the therapeutic framework as relevant. The work was not the point. The adjustment was the point. The confessional poets were not the only women making art out of the experience the feminine mystique was producing. They were perhaps the most visible, partly because the work they produced was so clearly connected to their biographical situations, and partly because the biographical situations ended tragically in ways that made the connection impossible to ignore. But there were many other women, in the suburbs and the faculty wife circles and the carefully tended houses, who were writing and painting and composing and thinking in the margins of their domestic lives, producing work that was the evidence of the self that the culture was asking them to suppress. Most of this work was never seen. It was written in notebooks that were not shared, or painted on canvases that were stored in attics, or composed in heads that had no instrument to play on. It was the work of women whose capability exceeded the scope of the life they were living, and who found ways to exercise that capability in private, in stolen time, in the spaces the domestic life left open when it left any open at all. The invisible archive of this work is one of the losses of the period that cannot be fully recovered, because loss of this kind leaves no record of itself. What can be recovered, and what has been partially recovered in the decades since the feminist movement created both the critical framework and the institutional support for such recovery, is the understanding that the women of the 1950s and early 1960s were not passive inhabitants of the culture that surrounded them. They were negotiating with it, resisting it in small ways, finding cracks in it, producing out of their constrained circumstances work and thought and feeling that exceeded what the culture intended for them. The negotiation was rarely visible, the resistance was rarely named, but it was happening, it was always happening, and it is part of the story. There is an economic argument to be made about the 1960s housewife, and it is an argument that was not being made at the time, and that is still not fully integrated into how we think about domestic labour, and it is worth making here because it provides a different kind of clarity than the psychological and cultural arguments we have been tracing. The domestic labour of the 1960s housewife was real work that produced real economic value. The cooking, cleaning, childcare, shopping, scheduling, emotional management and household administration that she performed were services that, had they been purchased in the market, would have cost significant amounts of money. The cost of a full-time cook, a full-time cleaner, a full-time childminder, and a household manager in the early 1960s, even at the low wages that domestic service commanded, would have been considerably more than the average post-war family could have afforded. Her labour was, in the most straightforward economic sense, subsidising her family's standard of living. This labour was not compensated. She received no wage, she received maintenance, housing, food, clothing, and she received, in theory, a share of her husband's income and his legal obligation of support. But these arrangements were not equivalent to compensation, because they were conditional in ways that a wage is not. They depended on the continuation of the marriage. They could be revoked, and in practice were frequently revoked, through divorce or desertion or death, with consequences for the woman that were often financially catastrophic. The woman who had spent 20 years producing economic value through her domestic labour had, at the end of those 20 years, no independent income, no pension, often no recent employment history, and no direct claim on the wealth that her labour had helped create. The legal framework of marriage in the early 1960s reflected this in its most basic structure. The married woman's legal personality was in many respects still subsumed in her husband's. She could not, in many states, open a bank account or take out a credit card in her own name without her husband's signature. She could not, in most cases, sign contracts independently. She had no legal claim to her husband's income beyond the maintenance he was obliged to provide. She was, economically speaking, a dependent, and her dependence was a choice she had been presented with as though it were a destiny. The women who understood this understood it with a clarity that the culture did not reward. The understanding of one's own economic precarity is not a comfortable thing to live with, and the culture provided strong incentives not to think about it too directly, not to examine too closely the terms on which the domestic arrangement rested. The incentive was partly psychological. Thinking about the precarity meant thinking about the possibility of its becoming actual, which was frightening. And partly it was social. A woman who questioned the economic arrangements of her marriage was questioning the entire structure of the domestic settlement, which was the structure on which her daily life depended. And so most women did not think about it directly. They kept the knowledge at the edge of awareness, available if needed but not examined. They knew, in the way one knows things one has decided not to confront, that their security was contingent, that it depended on the goodwill and continued presence of a person, over whose decisions they had limited control. They managed this knowledge the way they managed the unnamed feeling, through the continuous low-level effort of not thinking about it too directly, of keeping the surface of the day busy enough to prevent the knowledge from rising to the level of full consciousness. The feminist economists who would come later, in the 1970s and 1980s, developed frameworks for thinking about the value of domestic labour that made the economic argument explicit and quantified. They calculated what domestic labour was worth in market terms. They argued for changes in divorce law that would recognise the economic contribution of the homemaking spouse. They proposed policies, wages for housework being the most radical, that would make the compensation of domestic labour visible and real. These arguments were contentious, and they remain contentious, because the full recognition of domestic labour as economic production requires rethinking structures that are deeply embedded in both the economy and the culture. But even short of the most radical conclusions, the economic lens illuminates something that the psychological and cultural analyses can leave in shadow. The woman at the kitchen window was not only constrained by an ideology, she was constrained by a material arrangement. The ideology and the material arrangement supported each other. The ideology made the material arrangement seem natural and appropriate, and the material arrangement enforced the ideology by making the exit from the domestic sphere economically costly. You could not simply walk out of the house and into a different life, because the different life you would be walking into would be a much poorer one, at least initially, and the culture had given you no resources for managing that poverty. This is one of the reasons why Friedan's book, whatever its limitations and whatever the limitations of the movement it helped catalyse, was not sufficient to change the situation on its own. Naming the problem was necessary, but solving the problem required structural changes in the labour market, in the law, in the distribution of domestic labour within the household, in the provision of childcare and other supports for working parents, in the cultural frameworks that assigned the primary responsibility for children and home to women. These changes happened, some of them, in the decades after 1963. They happened slowly and incompletely and with considerable resistance, and they are still happening. The woman at the kitchen window was also a woman in an economic arrangement. She was a woman whose labour was valuable and whose value was unacknowledged, whose security was contingent and whose contingency was unexamined, whose dependence was structural and whose structural dependence was presented to her as natural and chosen. She was, in the most material sense, a worker without a contract, a producer without a share in the product, a person whose economic contribution to the society she lived in was fundamental and invisible. The exhaustion she carried was not only the exhaustion of physical and emotional labour, it was also the exhaustion of a person who senses, without being fully able to name it, that the terms on which she is participating in the world are not quite fair. In the months after The Feminine Mystique was published, the letters began arriving at Friedan's publisher and at her home address in a volume that surprised everyone, including Friedan herself. She had expected the book to be controversial. She had expected some women to recognise themselves in it. She had not expected the sheer quantity of the recognition, the intensity of it, or the specific quality of relief that seemed to permeate so many of the letters she received. The letters came from women of many different backgrounds and circumstances. They came from housewives in the suburbs of New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and dozens of smaller cities. They came from women who had been to good colleges and women who had not. They came from women who were deeply unhappy and women who had not known, until they read the book, that what they felt had a name. They came from women who were angry and women who were grateful and women who were confused and women who were frightened of what the recognition meant for the life they had built. Several themes recurred across many of the letters, and they are worth attending to because they illuminate the experience from the inside in a way that analysis, however careful, cannot entirely replicate. The first theme was relief. Over and over, in different words, the women who wrote expressed relief. Relief that the feeling was real, that it had a name, that it was not a symptom of personal inadequacy or psychological disorder. One woman, writing from a suburb of Cleveland, described reading the book as like having a window opened in a room where you had been breathing stale air for years and not quite knowing why you felt so tired all the time. Another from outside Boston said that she had read the book in a single sitting and had spent the following week trying to describe to her husband what it had meant to her and had been unable to find the words, and had finally simply given him the book and waited. The second theme was recognition. Not just recognition of the general situation Friedan described, but specific granular recognition of particular details. The coffee group conversations that never went anywhere, the way the magazine articles always assumed she wanted to be in the kitchen, the particular quality of the afternoon boredom that felt like something more than boredom and less than despair, the sense of watching herself from a slight distance that she had thought was unique to her. The specificity of the recognition is one of the things that distinguished the response to this book from the response to most books. It was not a general agreement with a general argument. It was a series of precise moments of someone else describing your life back to you. The third theme was anger. Anger at the culture that had told them what they should be. Anger at the advertising that had manipulated their desires. Anger at the doctors who had told them their dissatisfaction was a symptom. Anger at the therapists who had spent years trying to help them adjust to a situation that, as they now understood, was the problem rather than the solution. The anger was not always directed outward. Some women turned it inward first, angry at themselves for having believed the story for so long, for having suppressed the feeling rather than questioning its source. The anger was necessary. It was the beginning of the energy that would eventually fuel the political work that followed. The fourth theme was fear. Fear of what the recognition meant. If the domestic life was insufficient, if the role she had organised her entire adult existence around was not adequate to who she was, then what? The fear was not irrational. It was the reasonable response to a situation in which the only framework she had been given for understanding her life was being revealed as inadequate, without any clear alternative being immediately available. Naming the problem was not the same as solving it. Recognising that the cage was a cage did not open the door, and some of the women who wrote to Friedan were not sure they wanted the door opened, not because they were not suffering inside the cage, but because the world outside the cage was unclear and frightening and the cage at least had familiar walls. The fifth theme was loneliness. Not the loneliness of the domestic life, though that was there too, but a different and more particular loneliness. The loneliness of having felt for years that the feeling was yours alone. The loneliness of having been unable to say the thing to anyone, having had no language for it, having believed that its unnamability was evidence of its personal and shameful character. The discovery, through Friedan's book, that the feeling was shared, that it was not a symptom of individual deficiency, but a collective experience produced by a collective arrangement, was experienced by many of these women as the end of a particular isolation that had been among the most painful features of their situation. What did these women do with what they had recognised? The answers varied enormously. Some went back to school, some found part-time work, some began having conversations with their husbands that they had not been able to have before. Some joined, or later founded consciousness-raising groups. Some went to their doctors and refused the medication. Some stayed exactly where they were, in the same houses with the same routines, but with a different internal relationship to where they were, no longer believing that the insufficiency was their fault, no longer performing contentment they did not feel, no longer willing to accept the culture's insistence that their experience of their situation was the wrong experience. That last change may seem small, but it was not. A person who knows that the cage is a cage is different from a person who believes the cage is her natural habitat, even if both persons remain inside it. The knowledge changes something in the body's relationship to the space. It changes what is possible to say, even if what is possible to say is still, for now, very little. It changes the quality of the suppression, from active belief to conscious performance, which is a smaller suppression, and therefore a less exhausting one. It changes, in the most fundamental sense, the person's relationship to her own experience, from patient to witness, from sufferer to analyst, from the person who is happening to the person who's happening and also watching it happen and beginning to understand why. We've been awake for a long time now, following this woman through the October of her life. We have sat with her at the kitchen window and accompanied her through the fragmented hours of her day. We have been with her in the grocery store and the laundry room and the children's bedrooms and the living room where the television plays and the bedroom where she lies in the dark and thinks about tomorrow. Now it is late. The house is quiet. The children have been asleep for hours. Her husband's breathing beside her has slowed and deepened into sleep. The street outside is still, and the October night has a quality of presence that daytime does not. The stars, if the sky is clear, and the silence that is not quite silence, the small sounds of a suburb at rest, the distant traffic, the settling of the house, the occasional passage of a car whose headlights move across the ceiling and are gone. She's not asleep yet. She's in that territory between waking and sleep that has its own quality of consciousness, looser than the day's consciousness, less linear, more associative. The concerns of the day are still present, but they have lost their urgency. They float in the mind rather than demanding attention. The grocery list is there, but it is no longer pressing. The plumber will come on Thursday. The school trip form has been signed. Tomorrow's dinner is decided. And in the looseness of the almost sleep sometimes the other thing comes. The thing that the busyness of the day keeps at a manageable distance. Not always. Not every night. But sometimes, in the particular quality of this hour, the thing rises up with an unusual clarity, as though the suspension of the day's forward momentum has removed the barrier that normally keeps it at a distance. She does not fight it tonight. Tonight she lets it be there. She is tired, genuinely tired, the tiredness of the full day accumulated in her body. And in her tiredness there is a quality of patience that the waking hours do not often permit. She can let the thing be there. She can look at it, or rather feel it, the way you feel something in the dark that you cannot see clearly. Its edges and its weight, and its temperature, but not its full form. It is not only sadness, though there is sadness in it. It is not only frustration, though there is frustration. It is something more complicated than either of those, something that contains both, and also something else, something that might, in the right light, look almost like hunger. The hunger of a person who has not been adequately fed, not in the physical sense. She has plenty to eat, she knows this. But in some other sense, in the sense of having the full range of who she has engaged and exercised and used. She does not know this word yet. She does not have a framework for understanding what she is feeling in these terms. She has only the feeling. But the feeling is real, and it is hers, and in this almost sleep hour she allows herself to have it, without immediately reaching for the management strategies the day requires. She does not turn it into a task to be completed, or a symptom to be treated, or a proof of her inadequacy. She just has it. She's just a person having a feeling that she does not yet have the words for. The words are coming. They are, at this moment in October 1962, being assembled somewhere, in the notes and drafts and revisions of a woman in Rockland County, New York, who spent the last 5 years interviewing women who felt what this woman feels and trying to find the language adequate to what they described. The book is not published yet. The words have not arrived, but they are coming. And when they arrive, when the book reaches this woman in whatever way it reaches her, a friend's recommendation, a review in the newspaper, a copy left on the display table in the library, the experience of reading it will be the experience of having someone else's words fit exactly the shape of something that has been shapeless in her. The relief of that fitting, the exhaustion released, at least partially, into the knowledge that the exhaustion was not her fault. The solitude discovered to be all along a shared condition. For now, though, it is just her and the dark and the almost sleep and the feeling that has no name. For now, it is just October, and the house is quiet, and the oak tree outside is doing what oak trees do in October, which is to let go, slowly and beautifully, the leaves. It has been holding all summer, releasing them into the cool air, sending them down to the ground where they will become, in time, something else entirely. Let go now. Let the day go. Let the worry about tomorrow go. Let the grocery list and the dentist appointment and the hem that needs sewing dissolve into the warm dark of the bedroom. Let your body feel how tired it is. Let the tiredness be the weight that carries you down into sleep. Let the unnamed feeling be there if it wants to be there. It is not dangerous. It is yours. And it will still be there tomorrow and the day after, and eventually, not yet but eventually, it will have a name. The name will not fix everything. The name never fixes everything, but the name will make the thing speakable, and speakable means shareable, and shareable means you are not alone in it, and knowing you are not alone in it is the beginning of everything that comes after. Sleep now. The night is long and the morning is far away. The children are sleeping and the street is quiet and the October stars are doing what October stars do, which is to be present and indifferent and very beautiful, up there in the black sky above the suburb, above the house, above the kitchen window where, tomorrow morning, early, before anyone else is awake, you will stand again with your coffee and look out at the oak tree and feel the thing, and the day will begin again, and you will manage it the way you always manage it, imperfectly, with love, with a capable competence that no one will quite see, with the unnamed feeling kept at the edge of things, patient and waiting. Sleep. The story is still going, you're still in it, and somewhere in the future the name is waiting for you. She was not born a housewife. This is a statement so obvious it should not need to be made, and yet the culture of the 1950s treated the domestic destiny of women with such thoroughness that the process by which it was installed, the long preparation of a girl for the life she was expected to live, became invisible. The housewife was not made, she simply was. This was, of course, a fiction, and the fiction required a great deal of work to maintain. The making of the housewife began early. It began in the girl's bedroom, where the toys she was given were toys about domesticity, the miniature kitchen, the baby doll, the tea set. It began in the stories she was read, where the woman who got the happy ending was always the woman who was loved by a man, and the getting of that love was always the end of the story rather than the beginning of it. It began in the way her mother's time was organised, in the domestic rhythms of the household she grew up in the implicit curriculum of watching a woman manage a house and learning, without being explicitly taught, that this was what women did. The educational system reinforced what the household taught. The home economics classes that were standard in American secondary schools through the 1950s and into the 1960s taught girls to cook and sew and manage household budgets, and taught these things with the explicit understanding that the purpose of the teaching was to prepare the girls for their future roles as wives and mothers. This was not a secret curriculum. It was avowed and public and generally considered to be doing the girls a service. The girl who could make a decent pie crust and a well-fitted skirt was a girl who was adequately prepared for adult life. What the home economics class did not teach: how to manage money independently, how to negotiate a salary, how to evaluate a contract, how to maintain a sense of professional identity over the long term. These were not considered relevant skills for girls because the trajectory they were being prepared for did not require them. The girl's trajectory led, if it worked as intended through a brief period of employment or education, directly into marriage and the domestic sphere, and the skills required for that trajectory were the skills of the domestic sphere. College, for the girls who went, was a complicated interlude in this trajectory. The women's colleges, as we have noted, offered a genuine education and, in their best moments, a genuine vision of what women could be. The co-educational universities were more ambiguous. They offered women access to the same academic content as men, but within a social context that was organised around the expectation that women's primary purpose in attending was to find a husband. The word that was used, and used openly, without embarrassment, by college administrators and parents and the women themselves, was a MRS degree. You went to college to get your bachelor's degree, yes, but also, more importantly, to get your MRS degree, to meet the man you would marry. The women who arrived at these institutions with genuine intellectual ambitions found themselves negotiating between the official educational mission of the university and the social expectations that governed the life of the female student. They could be smart, but not too smart. Too much obvious intelligence was considered unattractive and therefore counterproductive to the primary goal. They could work hard at their studies, but not harder than the men in their classes, because outdoing the men was not consistent with the feminine modesty the culture required. They could aspire to interesting careers, but those aspirations were understood as temporary, as things to do before the real life began. The women who went to graduate school, the ones who tried to push through into the professional world rather than stopping at the altar, encountered resistance of a different quality. The graduate seminars of the 1950s were, for women, exercises in persistence under conditions of continuous mild discouragement. The professors who did not actively exclude women from their seminars or their research groups often simply failed to take them seriously, in the way that it is possible to not take seriously a person you have categorized as essentially ornamental. The women who persisted anyway, who built careers in the 1950s despite the resistance, were exceptional people doing something difficult, and they were not typical, and most of the women who had the ability to do what they did not in fact do it, because the cost was too high. The woman who ended up at the kitchen window in 1962 had almost always made a series of choices that were not quite choices, decisions made under conditions that significantly constrained the range of available options, decisions that were experienced as free, but were shaped by a social logic so thoroughgoing that freedom was largely illusory. She had chosen to marry, she had chosen to stop working, she had chosen to have children, she had chosen the house in the suburb, but the conditions under which she made these choices were not conditions of genuine freedom. They were conditions carefully designed to make a particular set of choices appear natural and desirable, and to make alternative choices appear dangerous and socially costly. Understanding this does not require us to deny the reality of her choices or to treat her as a passive victim of historical forces. She was not passive. She was an agent, doing the best she could with the options available to her. making the choices that seemed most reasonable and most likely to produce the life she wanted. The tragedy, if tragedy is the right word, which is debatable, was not that she made wrong choices. It was that the right choices were unavailable, that the range of available options had been constructed in ways that systematically excluded the choices that might have allowed her full capabilities to be expressed and her full self to be engaged. This is the distinction that the feminist analysis of the period introduced, and that has remained central to the analysis of women's situations ever since. The distinction between individual choices and structural conditions. The woman at the kitchen window had made individual choices. The structural conditions within which she made those choices had made the choice of the kitchen window the most available and most socially supported option. Both things are true simultaneously. She chose, and the choosing happened within a structure that she had not designed, and did not control, and had not been fully informed about when she made the choices that led her there. The girl who became the housewife was not told, as she sat in her home economics class learning to make pie crust, that the skills she was acquiring were preparation for a life of uncompensated labour. She was not told that the domestic role she was being prepared for would consume her full working hours while being categorised socially as not working. She was not told that the husband she would find at college would, in all likelihood, have a more powerful economic position in the marriage than she would, and that this asymmetry would shape the decisions of their shared life in ways that consistently prioritised his needs and options over hers. She was not told that the children she would have would be primarily her responsibility in ways that would constrain her options for decades. She was not told any of these things, because to tell her would have been to disturb the fiction that the domestic destiny was a freely chosen and genuinely fulfilling one. She found out later. She found out in the way that people find out things they were not told, through the experience of living inside the reality that the fiction had obscured. She found out in the kitchen, at the sink, in the October morning light, feeling the thing she had not been prepared to feel. The education had not included this. The magazines had not depicted it. The television had not shown it. But here it was, in her body, in the quiet of the morning before anyone else was awake, unmistakable and nameless and hers. There is a particular loneliness that belongs to women whose social world is organised around a role rather than a self, and it is a loneliness that the 1960s housewife experienced with particular acuteness. The friends she had were, in most cases, women in similar situations, other housewives, other mothers of young children, other inhabitants of the same suburb and the same decade and the same set of constraints. They shared a great deal, these women. They shared the daily texture of the domestic life, the specific knowledge of what it meant to keep a house with small children in it, the particular vocabulary of the grocery store and the school run, and the neighbour's opinion of the new family down the street. What they did not share, mostly, was the deeper layer of experience that the feminine mystique required them to keep private. The coffee group was a space for the surface of the domestic life, not for its depths. The conversation moved easily through the acceptable channels. The children's development, the husband's work in very general terms, the management of the household, the small dramas of the neighbourhood. It did not move, or did not move easily, through the channels where the real experience lived. The unnamed feeling, the sense of something missing, the question about whether this was sufficient, the exhaustion that went deeper than the housework. The social contract of the coffee group, the unspoken agreement about what was speakable and what was not, was enforced not through explicit rules, but through the responses that met violations of it. A woman who introduced a note of genuine dissatisfaction into the group's conversation would have been met not with anger, but with a specific kind of concern. The concern that was simultaneously kind and silencing. The concern that said, "You are feeling something you should not be feeling, and the appropriate response to that feeling is to see a doctor." This was not malicious. It was the logic of a community policing the conditions of its own coherence, doing what communities do when one of their members disrupts the shared fiction on which the community depends. And so the women kept the deeper layer private, and the keeping of it private was the loneliness. Not because they had no friends. They had friends, often close and genuine ones. But the friendship was constructed in the space above the unnamed feeling rather than in the space that included it. The friend who was warm and reliable and good company at the coffee group was not the same friend with whom you could say the thing. The confidences that passed between women in the suburb were confidences about the manageable difficulties of the domestic life, not about the unmanageable difficulty of the domestic life itself. The friendship that the unnamed feeling required, the friendship in which you could say the thing and be met with recognition rather than concern, in which the shared experience was the real experience rather than its social performance. This friendship was rare and valuable, and when it existed was experienced by both parties as a kind of relief that was almost physical. It was the friendship that Friedan's book produced in rooms across the country, when women who had read it called other women who had read it and said, "I read it," and the other woman said, "I know." The consciousness-raising groups of the late 1960s and early 1970s were, among many other things, a formal structure for creating the friendship that the coffee group had not been able to provide. The ground rules of consciousness-raising, speak from personal experience, listen without giving advice, no hierarchy of suffering, were designed precisely to create the conditions in which the real experience could be spoken. And what women discovered, in these groups, was not only that they were not alone in what they felt, but that the friendship formed in the space where the real experience was shared was a qualitatively different kind of friendship from what they had had before. It was fuller, more honest, less carefully managed. It was, many women said, the first friendship they had had as adults, in which they felt fully known. The women who preceded the consciousness-raising groups, the women of the early 1960s who had not yet had access to that structure, were not without the capacity for this kind of friendship. They found it in individual relationships, one at a time, in the specific coincidence of two people whose circumstances and temperaments and moments of desperation aligned in ways that made the deeper conversation possible. They found it in letters to old friends from college, where the distance and the written form permitted a candour that face-to-face conversation in the suburban social context did not. They found it in the particular kind of intimacy that sometimes develops between women who have been neighbours long enough and who have seen enough of each other's actual lives rather than the performance of those lives. But mostly they did not find it. Mostly the friendship they had was the friendship available in the social context they inhabited, which was the friendship of the surface, the friendship that was warm and reliable and real, but that stopped short of the layer where the named or unnamed feeling lived. And the absence of the deeper friendship was a form of isolation that lived alongside the busyness and the social contact of the domestic life without being alleviated by it. This is one of the things that makes the response to Friedan's book so remarkable. The letters she received were often, in effect, the confidences that the writers had not been able to share with anyone in their immediate social world. The book had created a space in which the real experience could be articulated, and the women who articulated it were articulating it to an absent interlocutor, a woman they had never met, because the interlocutors who were present in their lives had not been available for this kind of conversation. They were writing letters to a book because the people around them had not, until now, offered the possibility of being met with recognition rather than concern. What Friedan did, in writing that book, was make herself available as the recipient of all the confidences that had had nowhere else to go. She became, for millions of women, the friend who was able to hear the thing. This was not a small achievement. The capacity to be the recipient of another person's most carefully held and most rarely shared experience. To receive that experience with recognition rather than concern, with affirmation rather than redirection, with the simple acknowledgement that what is being said is real. This capacity is the foundation of the deepest kind of friendship and the precondition for the kind of collective recognition that makes political change possible. The word that surfaces most often in descriptions of the 1960s housewife's interior life is not exhaustion, though exhaustion is certainly present. It is not sadness, though sadness is present too. The word that surfaces most often, in the letters and the memoirs and the accounts that women gave in later years, is boredom. And boredom, the particular boredom of the 1960s housewife, is worth examining with some care, because it was not ordinary boredom and it was not a minor complaint. Ordinary boredom is the state of having nothing to do. It is the experience of an idle person, a person whose available activities are insufficient to engage their attention. The housewife's boredom was not this. She was never short of things to do. The list was always there, always refreshing itself, always offering the next task to be completed. She could not have been ordinarily bored if she had tried. Her boredom was something else. It was the boredom of repetition, of doing the same things over and over in the same sequence in the same space, without variation, without development, without the sense that the doing of them was building toward anything beyond their own completion. The dishes were washed and then dirtied and then washed again. The beds were made and then slept in and then made again. The floors were cleaned and then walked on and then cleaned again. The tasks completed themselves only to require completion again, and there was no narrative arc to this repetition, no development, no sense of moving toward a point at which the work would be done and something else could begin. The philosopher Hannah Arendt made a distinction that is relevant here, between work and labour. Work, in Arendt's usage, is the activity that produces a durable thing, an object that remains after the activity is ended. The table the carpenter makes, the book the writer writes, the building the architect designs, the product of work endures. Labour, by contrast, is the activity that produces something consumed in the consuming, the meal that is eaten, the clean floor that is dirtied, the managed emotion that is re-required. Labour leaves no durable trace. It must be performed again and again without accumulation, without legacy, without the satisfaction of pointing to something that persists. The domestic tasks of the 1960s housewife were, in this sense, almost entirely labour in Arendt's sense. They were consumed in the consuming. The meal she cooked with skill and attention was eaten and was gone. The house she cleaned to a standard of genuine beauty was immediately redirtied by the people who lived in it. The emotional atmosphere she managed with continuous care was disrupted and required management again the next morning. There was almost nothing in the domestic life that built, that added to a structure that would persist, that could be pointed to as the enduring product of her skill and effort. The children were the exception to this, and the culture knew it and made the most of it. The children were the work product, the durable thing that the housewife's labour was building. They would persist after the dishes were forgotten and the floors were redirtied. They would carry into their own lives the effects of the care she had given them, the values she had transmitted, the psychological health she had worked to produce. The children were the monument. This is true, and it matters, and many women found in it a genuine source of meaning that sustained them through the repetitive labour of the domestic life. The love of children, the investment in their development, the deep satisfaction of watching a person grow who could not have grown without you. These are real things. They are not reducible to ideology, not explainable away as false consciousness. They are among the most real things in human experience. But they are not sufficient on their own to fill the entire scope of an adult human life. The person who loves her children with genuine depth and who finds genuine meaning in their growth and development is not thereby a person who needs nothing else. The love of children is a form of engagement with the world, a real and important one, but it is not the only form of engagement a person needs. The woman who was told that it was sufficient, that the children were enough, that the monument of the children's flourishing was adequate to the full range of her human needs for meaning and engagement and the exercise of capability, was being told something that was partially true and largely inadequate. The boredom was the experience of the inadequacy. It was the experience of a person whose capacity for engagement was not being fully met, whose range of activities was too narrow for the range of her capabilities, whose world was too small for the person who lived in it. And it was experienced as boredom rather than as the more frightening thing it was, the experience of a self being underutilized, of a life being lived at a significant fraction of its possible fullness, because boredom is a more manageable concept than existential insufficiency. The afternoon hours were when the boredom was most acute, for the reasons we have already traced. The morning's tasks were done and the children were at school, and the forward momentum of obligation had temporarily slowed. And in the slowing, the boredom expanded. She would stand in the clean kitchen and look around at the order she had created and feel it pressing against her. The smallness of the world contained in that kitchen, the repetitiveness of the work that maintained it, the sense that there ought to be more than this, that the afternoon had more in it than the advanced preparation of tomorrow's dinner. She could not name this as what it was most of the time. The culture had not given her a framework for naming it. What it gave her instead was the concept of restlessness, which was considered a symptom rather than a perception, and the concept of neurosis, which was the name the medical establishment gave to her inability to find adequate contentment in the role the culture had designed for her. She was not restless because there was genuinely too little to engage her. She was restless because she had not properly adjusted to her role, and the adjustment, the therapy and the medication, and the continuous self-management required to maintain the performance of adequate contentment was the work on top of the work, the exhaustion on top of the exhaustion, the unnamed labour that exhausted more thoroughly than any physical task. The boredom that she felt in the afternoon was not trivial. It was the experience of a person's essential selfhood pressing against the limits of the container it had been placed in, looking for more room, failing to find it, pressing harder. The pressure was not sustainable indefinitely. Something eventually had to give. In some women it gave as breakdown, in others as the slow erosion of the unnamed feeling into a kind of numbness, in others as the political energy that went eventually into the feminist movement. In all of them, it was real, and it was there, and it was the afternoon light of October 1962 falling on a clean kitchen and a woman who had more in her than the kitchen had room for. The culture that confined the 1960s housewife to the domestic sphere also made demands on her appearance that were, in their way, another form of the same confinement. The beauty standards of the post-war decades were not separate from the ideology of the feminine mystique. They were continuous with it, another expression of the same underlying demand that women be primarily defined by their effect on others, rather than by their own capabilities and desires. The housewife of 1962 was expected to be attractive. This was not negotiable. The magazines that told her how to manage her household also told her how to manage her appearance, and the two sets of instructions were structurally identical. Here is the standard. Here is the method for achieving it. Here is the product that will help you reach it. The standard for her appearance was, like the standard for her housekeeping, one that required continuous effort to maintain and that produced anxiety when it was not met. She was supposed to be neat. Her hair was supposed to be done. She was supposed to be wearing the appropriate amount of makeup at the appropriate times. She was supposed to be wearing the right clothes, which were clothes that communicated the right things about her class position and her domestic status. She was not supposed to look like she had been cleaning all morning, even if she had been cleaning all morning. The management of her appearance was part of the domestic performance, part of the presentation of the household as a well-run and aesthetically coherent place. This management took time, and it took money, and it took attention. The hair that was always done, the face that was always appropriately made up, the clothes that were always appropriate. These things required daily work that was added to the daily work of the household itself. The routinization of beauty practices, the specific rituals of maintenance that a woman in the early 1960s was expected to perform on her body, was a form of labour that was so thoroughly normalized that it was rarely recognized as labour at all. It was simply what women did. It was the morning preparation, the daily maintenance, the occasional indulgence of the hairdresser appointment. It was invisible work that produced a visible result. The woman who appeared at the school gate or the grocery store or the 6 o'clock dinner to be effortlessly well presented. The effortlessness was, of course, effortful. The appearance of natural grace was the product of significant management, and the management was directed at producing not a version of herself that she found compelling or authentic, but a version of herself that met the standards the culture had set for women of her age and station. The standards were not hers, they were the culture's, and applying them daily, with care and competence, was another form of the continuous performance of a self that was not quite her own self. Age complicated this in ways that the culture preferred not to acknowledge directly. The beauty standards of the early 1960s were standards calibrated to youth, and the woman in her 30s who had been married for a decade and had borne 2 children was engaged in a losing battle with time on terms she had not set. The magazines that celebrated the domestic role and the domestic woman were magazines that illustrated that celebration with images of young women, women in their early 20s, women who had not yet been changed by the decade of domestic labour. The slightly older woman, the actual housewife of 1962, who was 35 and a little tired and a little worn by the years of managing the house and the children, saw in those images not a reflection of herself, but a standard she was already failing to meet. This was another form of the exhaustion. The management of the gap between the standard and the reality, the continuous effort of trying to maintain an appearance that was calibrated to a different moment in her life, was tiring in a way that was specific and that the culture did not acknowledge. The culture talked a great deal about the importance of the housewife maintaining her attractiveness for her husband, as though the primary function of her appearance was to sustain his interest, and the framing was itself revealing. Her appearance was for him, not for her. Its purpose was defined by its effect on another person, rather than by her own relationship to it. Some women found, in the rituals of beauty, something that was genuinely pleasurable, a form of attention to the self that the rest of the domestic life didn't often provide. The careful application of makeup, the monthly trip to the hairdresser, the selection of an outfit that felt right. These activities could be, and sometimes were, genuine pleasures rather than burdensome obligations. They could be moments of attention to oneself that were otherwise rare in the domestic day. The distinction between the pleasure and the burden was not always clear, and the same activity could be both simultaneously. But the underlying structure was one of obligation rather than choice. The woman who found genuine pleasure in her beauty routines was finding pleasure in something she would have been required to do regardless. She was finding the best available experience within a constraint, which is something that human beings are very good at and which should not be misread as contentment with the constraint itself. The pleasure was real, the constraint was also real, and the conflation of the pleasure with the constraint, the cultural insistence that women's beauty practices were expressions of their deepest desires rather than requirements imposed from outside, was another instance of the same technique that made the domestic role look like a choice. The mirror in the morning was one of the places where she encountered herself most directly, where the gap between the self she was performing and the self she actually was briefly legible. The face in the mirror before the makeup was applied was her face, the actual face, the face that had been asleep and was not yet prepared for the day's performance. There was something she sometimes saw in this face, a quality she did not have a word for, something between tiredness and waiting, something between resignation and refusal. That was not the face she showed the world. And the application of the makeup was, among other things, the application of the mask, the preparation of the performed self for another day of the performance. The children who grew up in the houses of the 1960s housewife grew up inside a particular emotional and social structure, and the effects of that structure on their development and their subsequent lives have been a subject of considerable research and a great deal of cultural reflection. The baby boom generation, the children of the post-war prosperity, who were children in the late 1950s and early 1960s, inherited from their parents an arrangement of domestic life that shaped them in ways that are still unfolding. What they inherited from their mothers was, first and most fundamentally, the model of femininity embodied in the housewife's role, the continuous self-sacrifice, the management of others' needs, the performance of contentment, the unnamed feeling kept carefully at the edge of the daily life. They absorbed this model through years of observation, in the way that children absorb the deep structures of the world they grow up in, before they have the conceptual apparatus to analyze what they are absorbing. They learned from their mothers what women were supposed to be. The daughters who grew up watching their mothers perform the feminine mystique had a particular inheritance, the model of the domestically organized woman as the primary available version of adult femininity, and the knowledge, gathered in kitchen window moments, and in the particular quality of their mother's tiredness, that this version was not entirely adequate to the women who performed it. They grew up with a doubleness installed in their understanding of what women were, the official version and the glimpsed other version, the performance and the person behind it. This doubleness produced in the baby boom daughters a range of responses that have shaped much of the cultural and political history of the last 50 years. Some daughters grew up determined to do something different, to live differently than their mothers had lived, to claim the public sphere and the professional world and the full exercise of their capabilities in ways their mothers had not been able to. These daughters became the feminist movement, not simply as an intellectual or political commitment, but as a lived practice, a daily effort to construct a life that was more adequate to the full range of who they were. Some daughters grew up with a more ambivalent inheritance, wanting what their mothers had wanted, the home, the family, the children, the love, but also wanting something their mothers had not been permitted to want publicly. These daughters attempted to have both, to be both the housewife and the professional, and discovered in the attempt the double burden that Hochschild would document in 1989. They worked full-time outside the home and continued to perform most of the domestic labour inside it, because the cultural assumption of women's primary domestic responsibility was more durable than the formal barriers to women's professional participation. They had more than their mothers had. They also had more to do. Some daughters watched their mothers with a love and a grief that were inseparable from each other, and carried that love-grief into their own adult lives as a kind of orientation toward the past, the understanding that their own lives were built on the labour and the suppression of women who came before them, that the freedoms they exercised had been made possible by the unfreedoms those women had endured, that the debt was real even if it could never be fully repaid. The sons who grew up in the same houses absorbed a different lesson. They absorbed from their fathers the model of the man who moved through the public world and came home to the private one. They absorbed from their mothers the expectation of domestic care that was structurally female, the expectation that the home would be maintained and the meals would be produced, and the emotional atmosphere would be managed by a woman. They absorbed, without being explicitly taught, the assumption that these things would happen without their primary effort, that the logistics of the domestic life would be handled by someone else, and that their primary contribution to the household would be financial. These assumptions were not always consciously held. The men who grew up in the 1950s and 1960s did not, for the most part, consciously decide to expect their partners to perform the majority of the domestic labour. The expectation was so thoroughly naturalised that it did not require conscious decision. It operated at the level of default, of what happened when no one made a deliberate effort to organise things differently. And the effort required to organise things differently, the ongoing negotiation, the explicit renegotiation of who did what and why, the willingness to be uncomfortable in the face of assumptions that felt like nature, was an effort that many men found it possible to avoid because the cost of not making it fell primarily on their partners. This is the mechanism of the second shift, the reason why women's entry into the workforce did not, by itself, produce an equitable distribution of domestic labour. The men who had been raised by 1960s housewives had been raised inside an arrangement that made domestic labour invisible and assigned it by default to women. Changing that arrangement required them to do something their upbringing had not prepared them for, to see the invisible work, to claim a share of it, to do it without being asked and without requiring acknowledgement for doing it. This was genuinely difficult, not because the men were bad people, but because the difficulty had been installed in their understanding of the world before they had the conceptual equipment to examine it. The daughters of the 1960s housewife who became the feminist movement understood this mechanism with increasing clarity over the course of the 1970s and 1980s. They understood that changing the formal rules was necessary but not sufficient. They understood that the deep structure of the domestic arrangement, the structure installed by decades of the feminine mystique, was a structure that survived the formal changes and continued to shape the daily lives of women who were, in theory, fully emancipated. They understood that the work was not done, and they went on working. We are still working. The daughters' daughters are still working, still negotiating the deep structure of the domestic arrangement, still finding that the formal equalities they have been granted do not automatically produce the informal equalities they were supposed to entail, still discovering that the second shift exists, and that the cognitive load is real, and that the emotional labour falls unevenly, and that these are not individual failures but structural conditions. The woman at the kitchen window in 1962 would recognise something in the situation of her granddaughter in 2024, not everything. The granddaughter has more options and more language and more support than the grandmother had. But the recognisable shape is there. The conversation is not over. The suburb was not only a physical arrangement, it was a social one, and the social arrangement of the suburb in the late 1950s and early 1960s was organised around a particular set of norms and expectations that shaped the daily life of the women who inhabited it, with a thoroughness that was both supportive and constraining. The neighbourhood was the community that had replaced the denser, more varied, more anonymous community of the city neighbourhood, and it was a community with specific ideas about what belonging looked like. The neighbourhood norms were enforced not through explicit rules, but through the continuous social monitoring that is the characteristic enforcement mechanism of small, relatively homogeneous communities. Everyone knew what was expected. Everyone knew who was meeting the expectation and who was falling short. The visible markers of the adequate housewife, the clean house, the tidy yard, the children who were presentably dressed at appropriate times, the husband who departed for work each morning and returned each evening, were legible to the neighbourhood as a whole, read continuously and assessed against the shared standard. This monitoring was not only hostile, it contained genuine community. the casserole delivered to the family with a sick mother, the children looked after by a neighbour in an emergency, the accumulated small assistance of people who'd been watching each other long enough to know when watching needed to be supplemented by action. The community of the suburb was real, and the women who lived in it had real relationships with their neighbours, relationships that were a genuine form of support and that made the daily life more manageable in practical ways. But the monitoring was also constraining in ways that the genuine community did not entirely mitigate. The woman who felt the unnamed feeling, who was struggling, who was not performing the domestic role with the smooth competence the neighbourhood standard required, was performing in front of an audience. The neighbour who could tell when the curtains had not been opened by 10 o'clock. The woman at the coffee group who noticed that the casseroles had become less elaborate recently. The general social awareness, which was both warm and relentless, of how things were going in each house on the street. The performance anxiety this produced was real, and it added to the total burden of the domestic life in ways that are easy to underestimate. The woman who was managing her household was managing it in public, in the particular sense that the suburb made the domestic life a semi-public performance. She was not doing it for herself alone. She was doing it for the neighbourhood's view of it, for the standard the neighbourhood maintained, for the social capital that accrued to the woman who met the standard, and the social cost that accrued to the woman who fell short. The class dimension of this is important and should not be skipped over. The suburb we have been describing is a particular kind of suburb, the post-war American suburb that was predominantly white and predominantly middle class, and the norms of that suburb were the norms of that particular class and racial position. The woman we have been following at the kitchen window is a white woman of the middle class, and her situation, while genuinely constraining, was the situation of a woman whose material circumstances were significantly better than those of many other women in the same period and the same country. The women of colour who were excluded from the post-war prosperity, from the Dewey Bill mortgages and the suburban developments, and the world of the Ladies' Home Journal housewife, had different and in many ways harder situations. The black women who were employed as domestic workers in the houses of the white middle class were performing, for wages, the labour that the white housewife performed for free, and performing it in the most directly exploited possible form, with no security, no legal protections, no recognition. The analysis of the feminine mystique that Friedan performed was an analysis of white middle-class femininity, and its limitations in this respect are real, and have been extensively criticised by women of colour who found that the movement it helped catalyse did not adequately represent their interests. This criticism is valid and important, and it should not be smoothed over in the interest of a cleaner narrative. The history of American feminism's relationship to race is a history of partial vision and periodic exclusion that has been the most significant source of internal conflict within the movement and the most significant failure of the movement's aspiration to speak for all women. The unnamed feeling of the white suburban housewife was real. The different and often more acute experiences of women of colour in the same period were also real. These realities coexisted without one cancelling the other, and understanding the full picture requires holding both simultaneously. The neighbourhood, in the suburbs we have been describing, was also a neighbourhood shaped by the legal and social exclusions that maintained its racial homogeneity. The redlining that kept black families out of the post-war suburbs, the restrictive covenants that explicitly excluded non-white purchasers, the general apparatus of housing discrimination that was a central feature of post-war American life. These were the mechanisms that produced the demographic uniformity of the suburb, and the uniformity of the suburb was the precondition for the social norms we have been describing. A more diverse community would have had more diverse norms, and more diverse norms would have made the performance of any single version of femininity less totalizing and less inescapable. This is not to say that the white women of the suburb were the architects of the exclusions that produced their community's homogeneity. Most of them were not making deliberate choices about housing policy, but they were living inside arrangements whose maintenance required, and was made possible by, the exclusion of others, and the comfort and the constraint of their lives were both shaped by that exclusion in ways they mostly did not examine. The examination requires, as it always does, stepping back from the immediate texture of daily life and looking at the larger structure. And stepping back is difficult when you're in the middle of the daily life, when the immediate texture is pressing and demanding and consuming all of the attention that might otherwise be available for the larger view. Architecture is argument. The houses that the post-war developers built were not neutral containers. They were arguments about how life should be organised, about who should be where and for what purpose, about the proper arrangement of human beings in space. The argument the suburban house made was an argument about gender, and it made that argument in the most fundamental possible way, through the organisation of physical space and the assignment of that space to the people who would inhabit it. The kitchens of the post-war suburban houses were large and well equipped by historical standards. They were the most carefully considered rooms in the house, designed with attention to workflow and storage and the management of the domestic operations that were understood to be the primary occupant's primary responsibility. The kitchen in the house plans of the period was the room that received the most thought, that appeared most prominently in the advertising for the house, that was described with the most care in the real estate listings. This was not because the architect or the developer considered the kitchen the most important room. It was because the kitchen was understood to be the woman's room, and the woman's room needed to be adequate to the woman's work. The bedroom was private, intimate, shared with the husband. The living room was public, a room for the family's social presentation to visitors, designed to accommodate the husband's relaxation in the evenings. The children's rooms were small and functional. The study, if there was one, was for the husband, for the man who might bring work home from the office, who might need a space for the extension of his public role into the private sphere. There was no equivalent room for the woman, no study in which her mind's work might take place, no space that said, "Here is where you go when you want to think." This spatial organisation was not a personal choice made by the people who lived in these houses. It was a structural given, a decision made in the design process that preceded their occupancy, an argument that had already been made before they moved in. The woman who wanted a space for work that was not domestic work had to create it out of the existing spaces: the corner of the bedroom, the kitchen table after the dishes were done, the back of the closet where the paper and pen were kept. She had to make a study out of fragments of the spaces that had been designed for other purposes. The spatial confinement was experienced physically, in the body, as the body's knowledge of its own circling. The woman who spent her day in the kitchen and the adjacent rooms of the house was a woman whose world was measured in yards rather than miles, whose daily geography was a small and highly familiar set of spaces that changed very little from day to day. The walk to the grocery store or the school was the primary expansion of this geography, the daily traversal of a slightly larger space that provided a physical relief the body registered even when the mind was occupied with lists and logistics. Human beings are territorial creatures in a profound sense. We define ourselves partly through the spaces we inhabit and the spaces we can move through. The restriction of a person's available space is a restriction of their sense of self as much as it is a physical limitation. The prisoner who is confined to a small cell is not only physically constrained, she is constrained in her sense of her own agency and her own scale in the world. The constraint is less dramatic in the case of the suburban housewife, but it is structurally similar. A world organised around a kitchen, however large and well equipped the kitchen is a small world. And a person who inhabits a small world for long enough begins, at some level below consciousness, to feel small. The neighbours knew this, even if they did not name it. The intense interest that suburban women took in each other's houses, the attention to who had redecorated, who had added a new appliance, who had done something interesting in the garden, was, among other things, the expression of a powerful need to expand the available world within the limits the domestic confinement imposed. The neighbour's kitchen was an extension of one's own world, a variation on the familiar space, evidence that other arrangements of the domestic sphere were possible. The decoration and maintenance of the house was an aesthetic act performed under constraint, a way of exercising the kind of spatial and aesthetic agency that the confinement limited. The garden, where the suburb permitted it, was an important space. It was the space between the house and the street, the space that was both private and semi-public, the space where the domestic sphere met the wider world in a managed and mediated way. The attention women paid to their gardens, the planting and weeding and the cultivation of the front lawn and the backyard, was partly practical, partly social. The garden was visible to the neighbourhood and subject to the neighbourhood's assessment, and partly something harder to name. It was time spent in a space that was larger than the kitchen, that was outdoors, that had seasonal variation and growth, and the small surprises that living things provide. The garden was not the world, but it was, for many women, the closest available approximation of it. The woman who stood at the kitchen window was looking out at this space. The semi-private garden with its established plants and its seasonal changes, the familiar yard that contained the children's play equipment, and the oak tree with its turning leaves. She was looking out from the domestic interior into the domestic exterior, and beyond the garden fence the neighbourhood continued, and beyond the neighbourhood the suburb continued, and beyond the suburb the city continued, and beyond the city the world continued, the vast and various world in which things happened and ideas developed, and people exercised their capabilities to their full extent. She could see the edge of her garden. She could not see the world, but she knew it was there. While the woman at the kitchen window was managing the domestic sphere, the world outside her window was moving in directions that would eventually arrive at her door. The late 1950s and early 1960s were years of particular turbulence in American society, and the turbulence was not confined to the civil rights movement, or the counterculture, or the political upheavals that would intensify as the decade continued. It was also an economic turbulence, a quiet but significant transformation in the structure of the American economy that was, without anyone necessarily intending it, creating the conditions for women's mass entry into the workforce. The service economy was expanding. The post-war American economy had begun the transition from manufacturing to services that would continue and accelerate through the second half of the 20th century, and the service sector was a sector in which women's employment was more established and more accepted than in manufacturing or the professions. Office work, retail work, nursing, teaching, social work. These were fields in which women had always been present, and the expansion of the service economy was an expansion of the kinds of work in which women's labour was already being used. The labour shortage in certain sectors created pressure for the employment of married women that the ideology resisted. Companies that needed workers found, increasingly, that the pool of available single women was insufficient to meet their needs, and that married women, housewives, represented an enormous reservoir of capable, often educated labour that was being systematically underutilised. The economic argument for employing married women ran directly against the ideological argument for keeping them at home, and the economic argument was, over the course of the 1960s, winning. The women who responded to the economic opportunity and entered or re-entered the workforce were not, for the most part, acting on a conscious feminist analysis of their situation. They were responding to financial need, or to opportunity, or to the specific boredom of the domestic sphere that was more manageable when it was understood as temporary rather than permanent. The feminist analysis came later, or ran alongside the economic decision without being its cause. The decision itself was made in the vocabulary of the particular woman's particular circumstances, the mortgage that was becoming difficult to manage on one income, the children who were old enough not to need full-time maternal care, the job offer that appeared at a moment when it could be acted on. The re-entry into the workforce was not without its complications. The woman who had been a housewife for 10 years and had not worked outside the home since her mid-20s was a woman whose recent employment history was a blank, whose professional skills might be out of date, whose confidence in her own capability in a professional context might have been eroded by the years of domestic life. The labour market received her with ambivalence, glad of the labour, uncertain about the competence, unwilling to acknowledge the skills she had developed in her domestic years as equivalent to professional experience. She was hired, typically, at the bottom of whatever hierarchy she entered, regardless of her pre-domestic qualifications, regardless of the complexity of the organisational and management skills she had exercised in running a household. The years of domestic management, the logistics, the budgeting, the personnel management of a household with young children, the constant problem-solving and planning and adjustment, these were invisible to the employer who looked at her resume and saw only the gap. She entered the workforce, in other words, at a disadvantage that was itself a product of the domestic arrangement, a second penalty added to the first. Despite all of this, women entered the workforce in increasing numbers through the 1960s. They entered despite the disadvantage and despite the double burden, and despite the ambivalence of the cultural reception, and despite the inadequacy of the support structures available for working parents. They entered because the alternative, the domestic life as sole occupation, was for many women not adequate. The unnamed feeling pushed, the economic opportunity pulled, and the world outside the kitchen window began, very gradually, to make room. This making of room was not primarily the result of the feminist movement. though the feminist movement played an important role in articulating the demand and organising the political pressure that made formal changes possible. It was the result of a complex of economic, demographic and cultural forces that were converging in ways that made women's entry into the workforce not only possible, but from the economy's perspective, desirable and eventually necessary. The economy wanted the labour, the ideology resisted, the economy won. What the economy did not do, in claiming this victory, was restructure itself to accommodate the reality of workers who were also the primary caregivers for households and children. The workplace that absorbed women in the 1960s and 1970s was a workplace designed for workers who had wives, workers who could bring their full working capacity to the job because someone else was managing the domestic sphere. The woman who entered this workplace brought her full working capacity and also continued to manage the domestic sphere, and the workplace did not adjust its expectations to account for this. She was expected to perform as though she were a worker who had a wife, even as she was herself the wife, and the performance required of her was, as we have already noted, extraordinary. The woman at the kitchen window in 1962 is standing at the beginning of this transformation. She does not know what is coming. She does not know that within a decade the culture will have shifted enough that the choice she has made, or been made to make, will be more genuinely a choice for the women who come after her. She does not know that the unnamed feeling she carries will have a name before the year is out, or that the name will help produce the movement that will help produce the changes that will make her granddaughter's life different from her own. She's just standing at the kitchen window in October, watching the oak tree turn. The distance between naming a problem and solving it is almost always longer and harder than the naming makes it seem. The history of the feminist movement in the decades after 1963 is a history of discovering, repeatedly and sometimes painfully, how far the gap extended between the recognition that the arrangement was inadequate and the actual reconstruction of the arrangement into something more adequate. The early years of the women's movement produced a sense of momentum and possibility that was genuine and important. Women who had never before spoken about their experience as women began speaking, in consciousness, raising groups, and in the emerging feminist press and in the new academic field of women's studies that was beginning to form in universities. The speaking produced writing, and the writing produced theory, and the theory produced politics, and the politics produced legal change. The Equal Pay Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the establishment of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Supreme Court decisions that extended constitutional protections to women in ways they had not been extended before. These were real changes, produced by real political effort, and they mattered. And then the work continued, because it turned out that the formal changes were necessary but not sufficient. The laws that prohibited employment discrimination did not, by themselves, produce equal employment outcomes. The formal right to equal pay did not eliminate the gap between what men and women actually earned. The educational opportunities that opened to women in the 1970s did not automatically translate into professional outcomes, because the professional world continued to be organised around assumptions about careers and commitment that made it harder for people who were also primary caregivers to advance at the same rate as people who were not. Each decade produced a new version of the conversation about what was still inadequate and what still needed to change. The 1970s produced debates about reproductive rights and domestic violence, and sexual harassment, and the representation of women in media and politics. The 1980s produced debates about the second shift and the glass ceiling, and the mommy track, and whether the movement had adequately addressed the concerns of women of colour and working-class women. The 1990s produced debates about work-life balance and the possibilities and limits of having it all. Each decade's conversation built on the previous decades and extended it, identifying new dimensions of the original problem or revisiting old dimensions with new tools. The women who are having these conversations now in the third decade of the 21st century are having them with better resources and more language and more institutional support than the women of 1963 had. They are having them in a context where the formal barriers are largely down, and the cultural representation of women is genuinely more varied, and the legal framework provides genuine protections. And they are still having them, because the deep structure of the arrangement has not yet fully changed, because the cognitive load and the second shift and the emotional labour and the expectation that women will manage more than is acknowledged are all still there, in varied and sometimes new forms, recognizable to anyone who knows what she's looking at. The woman at the kitchen window in 1962 could not have imagined the specifics of the world her granddaughter would inhabit in 2024. She could not have imagined the internet or the smartphone or the professional world her granddaughter might move through, or the legal protections her granddaughter takes for granted. But if she could have somehow looked forward into that world, she would have recognized something. She would have recognized the tiredness. She would have recognized the sense of managing more than is seen. She would have recognized the gap between the formal equality and the lived reality, the distance between what the world says is possible for women and what the daily texture of women's lives actually contains. The recognition would not be cause for despair. It would be cause for the continuation of the work, which is what it has always been cause for. The women who came before her recognized the same things, in different forms and different centuries, and they did the work of naming and organizing and demanding and building, and their work made things better than they were, which made further work possible. That is the shape of the story. It is not triumphant in the simple sense, it is ongoing. She turns away from the window. The coffee percolator has finished. The children will be down in 10 minutes. There is breakfast to make and lunches to prepare and the day to begin. She pours her coffee. She stands for a moment with it in her hands, looking at the steam rising. She is tired, with the tiredness of all the mornings before this one that have been like this one. She is also, in some way she cannot quite name, something else. Something that is not tiredness. Something that is more like the feeling you have when you're about to begin something, when the beginning is right there, when the possibility of the beginning is as close as the steam rising from the coffee in the October morning kitchen. She does not know what the beginning is. She does not know that it is coming, or that the naming of it is already happening, in a woman's notes in a house in Rockland County, New York, in the chapters of a book that will be published in 4 months. She does not know any of this. She just stands in the kitchen with her coffee in the October light, feeling the thing she cannot name, feeling it with a clarity that this particular morning has made sharper than usual. And the children come downstairs and the day begins, and she turns to meet it with all of the competence and care she has always brought to the turning. She is remarkable. She is ordinary. She's every woman who has stood in every kitchen in every October morning of every year, managing the unmeasured work of keeping the people she loves alive and fed and cared for. She is the woman the culture made and the woman the culture could not entirely contain. She is tired, and she is, in the deepest possible sense, still here.